This is a duo performance.
Yeah, well, hi, hello everyone. So the only thing more daunting than talking for only 10 minutes about the Beehive, a commonplace book that Francis Daniel Pastorius kept beginning in 1696 with thousands of entries and hundreds of authors documenting his life in colonial Pennsylvania, and a book that's haunted me for the past 10 years now, is also trying to talk in 10 minutes about just how important Peter Stalabras has been as a teacher and mentor in my life. But I have two strategies for combating that. First, I'm teaming up with John Pollock, so all of his 10 minutes are also mine, and I take credit for anything, the best that he might say. But also the point we're making in collaborating is that it's impossible to thank Peter without also thanking many other people in this room, because his collaborations have always inspired collaboration. So thank you to Dan, to Barbara, to Lynn, wherever you are, to Annie, to Margreta. There's so many of you who have made this place my home. Second strategy is that in addition to doubling my time, I'm going to be doubling my meanings. So when I say Pastorius, you can hear Peter. I reread it and it roughly works out. But so I say Pastorius, you should know that you can also replace his name with Peter Stalabras, and I have a couple of example sentences to kind of get us listening in this mode. So for the past 10 years, Pastorius has continued to inspire and transform my ideas about the history of reading. Although it has been excerpted in print, Pastorius never published The Beehive. Sorry. But relatedly, I would say The Beehive would not necessarily make sense published in isolation. So we'll come back to each of these in due course.
And I have a similar brief opening along the same lines. So Brooke and I are honoring a scholar, collector, intensive reader, extensive reader, Bible reader, compiler, writer, author, commonplacer, adopted Pennsylvanian, gardener, note-taker, teacher. That is Francis Peter Daniel Stalabras Pastorius. And see if we can illustrate. There are no known live images of Pastorius, so the closest we can get is that. We're interrogating a book created by one of these individuals and read by the other. It's a wonderful, paradoxical, lovable, frustrating, half crazy and confused, rich, pleasurable, and unfinished book, much like the reader, Stalabras. And we're working collaboratively today, as Brooke has said. I apologize for rough edges in my remarks and not enough quiet hours in the day to do justice to Brooke's really rich project. And we probably both owe our chair, Anne, an apology for sending her a lot of notes, but it is a session on note-taking after all. I'm going to start by a very brief biography and a review of this book and its modern readers. We're going to tell you something about this mysterious Pastorius, because some of you might know him a little less intimately than we do. Born 1651 in Sommerhausen, Germany, son of a lawyer and another commonplacer named Melchior Adam Pastorius and his wife Magdalena Pastorius. Trained as a lawyer himself, Francis Daniel. After practicing in Windesheim, Francis Daniel Pastorius turned to pietism and moved to Frankfurt am Main. Following William Penn's recruitment efforts, Frankfurt Pietists formed a company to purchase land in Pennsylvania, and they named Pastorius their agent. Pastorius traveled to Rotterdam, London, and then Philadelphia in 1683. He worked to establish the settlement of Germantown for the Frankfurt Society and for a group of Krefeld Quakers. He married Anna Klosterman in 1688, and they had two sons. He He worshiped with the Quakers and helped prepare the remarkable and radical 1688 Germantown protest against slavery. He served as legal recorder and scribe, along with many other roles in Germantown, and he taught in its earliest schools. Beginning in 1696, he began his massive commonplace book, The Beehive, and he continued adding to it until his death in 1719. Now, we should add, this was only one of his many manuscript books, most of which survive today in Philadelphia institutions. Peter and Roget, of course, have taught us to ask the question, what is a book? So, what is this book? It is in its simplest form a massive notebook. I show you here several older photos of it to give you the idea. A heap of notes wrapped in a parchment binding. These photos actually date from when the Beehive arrived at Penn around 1949 after having been for decades tucked in a bank vault. But we need to present a full material history a la Peter of this book and its multiple lives. After its arrival at Penn, we repackaged it in 1952 at great expense in order to probably, quote-unquote, save it, turning its expansiveness and messiness and fragility into a book, a textual monument in two impressive blue-bound volumes, with each page encapsulated, in a sense, frozen in time. Its binding remains separate, a fascinating and somewhat ghoulish reminder of what this object once looked like. The library, that is, radically transformed and remade the Beehive. We made it from notes into book, turning it from this massive yet portable bundle of papers that I showed you, notes taken upon notes with a provision for infinite expansion, into an impressive book and monument of American literary history. And I'm going to give you a little review of some of that American literary history, because since that public rediscovery of the Beehive in the 50s, there have been ongoing critical difficulties in interpreting the meanings and purpose of this spectacular object. The book, that is, doesn't quite fit into the boxes, dare I say, the critical hives that we'd like to put it into. Pastorius has been read in his Beehive for his role as German-American pioneer, a kind of cultural hero and founder. There actually used to be Pastorius Day celebrations in Germantown and other German-American communities in the U.S. In this poem, on one of the title pages of the Beehive, Pastorius celebrates his learning in these 7 languages and asks anyone to find this book lost to return it to him in Germantown. He's been taken as a figure who brought a style of German Baroque literature to America. The champion of this school of thought was actually a scholar named Harald Jantz. But Jantz thought of the Beehive as a book, and he actually therefore thought he could edit and publish it, the whole thing. You can see it in Lee Library later. There is in our files here a rather painful series of letters between curator Lyman Riley, himself a scholar of the Beehive, and Professor Jantz. Jantz claimed he was well on his way to publishing a complete edition of the Beehive in 1951. In 1983, nearly a quarter century later, he was forced to admit he would never complete it. A complete transcription he claims to have made seems to have been lost. It's not clear to me how one could ever actually edit pieces like this, a visual palindrome by Pastorius on his wife's name, Anna. It's actually a well-known Latin palindrome, probably written down first by William Camden, and means roughly, Anna holds the wet napkin. We can go back to the Latin later, Anne, if we want to. So Pastorius was, for a certain group of Germanist scholars, a figure who writes the beginning of a literary tradition called German-American literature. There was an important project in the 1980s entitled America and the Germans, edited by Penn's Frank Trumler, and Pastorius figures in that series again as an origin point. A related project undertaken by other scholars was to claim Pastorius as the first German-American poet. The Beehive is full of poetry and word games, Pastorius loved to play, for example, on the letters of his own name, FDP, Symbole Onomastica, every line there, follow the divine principle, fleshly lusts, drunkenness, plays. You get the idea, FDP. The problem is, if it's poetry, it doesn't really serve as the origin of anything in American literature. Charles Bernstein, whom Peter actually introduced the Beehive to, sums up this paradox. The Beehive, Bernstein writes, is a foundational work of American poetics, even if few American poets know it. Another approach is to see the Beehive as a kind of multilingual achievement. Pastorius was the figure chosen by Werner Solers to open his important multilingual anthology of American literature. Some of you might remember that. This Wheel of Fortune sketch sort of suggests Pastorius' multilingual stylistics. But that approach struggles with the fact that even a cursory reading of the Beehive reveals that Pastorius is a devoted Anglophile, insistently writing nearly all of the book, and many of his other books as well, in English, and citing a heavily Anglo group of sources. We're going to hear much more about that from Brooke. Even its most recent readers, I think, struggle to place Pastorius. There are tensions between Pastorius the commonplacer and Pastorius the maker of a new community. Anthony Grafton, who I think learned of the Beehive from Peter and Jim Green, is that probably right? We'll say it's right. Also attempts, and he's not here to correct us, also attempts to place Pastorius in his wonderful essay, The Republic of Letters in the American Colonies. Grafton finds in Pastorius a corner of a humanist pre-Enlightenment, connected deeply with a past but separate from it, or separated from it, rejecting tradition yet embodying it. Grafton would have us replace Pastorius in a European scholarly tradition rather than a German-American one, and in that sense the Beehive may mark the end of something rather than the beginning of something really new. Now, if most scholars have sought ways to categorize this uncategorizable book, Peter does not. For years, quietly, in classes and with students at Penn, he's been teaching us to recover the active, incomplete, and unfinished side of this book, its notes and its notable pleasures. He turns the Beehive back from a book into a copious set of notes, back really into a commonplace book. And you can note, if you can read that right up at the top in a little note at the very first page of the Beehive, Pastorius tells us right at the outset that that is what this book is. Scholars, it is good, I can read it from here. Zealous scholars should have a commonplace book and therein to treasure up whatever deserves his notice.
So when I first started working with the Beehive, like any undergraduate with a heavy course load and a very busy social calendar, I really only focused on the first 60-odd pages. And that was where I constrained my reading to. But a lot happens in the first 60 pages, in my defense. The choice of the manuscript's name is addressed at length, a beehive, for as a bee goes from flower to flower, drawing pollen to turn into honey, so should a scholar go from book to book, culling good excerpts to sort of sweeten thought. Reading is fundamental, but anyone can be a bee. It is about the care you take in your reading. And Pastorius notes that a bee will gather honey from the same flower where a spider will gather poison. And those first 60-odd pages contained repeated descriptions and a series of revised title pages that really refined his project of a commonplace book as one that became increasingly open. The Beehive preserved its own development in that way. He kept all of those title pages so you can track its openness. So old indexes changed over time to account for an expansion in content as well as to facilitate easier recall. So, for instance, earlier stages of the manuscript once had a closed sort of alphabetical index and a bibliography of texts that discriminated between Quaker and no Quaker readers, because Pastorius was sort of performing his conversion from Pietism to Quakerism, I'd say. Later, the system was dispensed with altogether for an open, numerically open system that was then paired with keywords that would be put back into an alphabetical index in columns with generous space for new additions. And then finally, that index itself moved outside of the text to a smaller, sort of easier octavo that you could use to consult the large folio. All of that is in the Lee Library if you want to have a look for yourself. He writes repeatedly in those first pages, not only about how to use the book, but also on how it evolved over time. And the first, and there are two quotes that have always stood out to me in particular about these opening pages. The first is addressed to his two sons, John Samuel and Henry Pastorius, who are named as the inheritors of the book. And he says, JSP and HP, for whose sake it is made, mind over and over and over, but not overly. Mind what and how you're reading. And when I say I'm haunted by this manuscript, this is why, because his sons did not listen to their father. They sold his library when he died, and they never added to the Beehive except in one way. When he died in 1719, they started to add a family tree to the back. So in a way that often family Bibles will preserve family genealogies in them, that is what the book became. Although there is no Quaker Bible, so it would make sense that the family heirloom that they would use would be their father's notebook. But Pastorius also had another excerpt that has always stuck out to me. That kind of works against the way in which the book became a time capsule and a sort of family heirloom. And this was translated from Latin by Alfred Brophy, and it addresses a sort of unnamed reader. And he says, "Be my corrector. As you cut away the truths that are superfluous, reader, may you also deign to add truths which are lacking. Much work remains and will remain, nor will anyone in 100,000 years lack the occasion to add something." This is some, like, I was talking to Anne about this earlier. It's a pretty serious humanist science fiction, I think, wrapping our minds around someone who's thinking 100,000 years into the future. I think implies a lot for the past and future of the history of reading. Pastorius' mentality is shockingly practical and unsentimental. He tells his readers to correct him, to cut away truths if necessary, and to add what's lacking. So he makes no claims to authority. And he leaves behind instructions by which his students might extend, erase, improve upon, or argue with what he has created. I think it's a statement that really grapples with a sense of loss unflinchingly. While Pastorius is one to point out and draw from a position that somewhat exalts or fetishizes the book as object, he does not overly kind of being where we draw our title from, he does not overly fetishize the text as an object. He's fine with you deleting what you might deem necessary. He trusts future readers thousands of years into the future to do this. And that is saying something at the close of the 17th century amongst a Quaker community. I mean, early Quaker pamphlets that he reads and cites in this book are pamphlets in an apocalyptic tone that talk about the end of days. So Pastorius isn't concerned with that when it comes to the idea of an open-ended project for knowledge. And it does relate to shifts in Quaker mentality towards the spiritual sort of second coming, because around this time, they start to believe that the second coming has already come within everyone. It becomes internalized. And so that does sort of open up the Beehive even further to this idea of 100,000 years in the future. But if anyone knows of any other scholar at the time period talking that far into the future, and that specifically, I'd love to hear about it. But nevertheless, that statement of Pastorius really sets his sons, and indeed the legacy of the book as it was kept by the family, in really stark relief. They kept the book as an artifact. It was acquired by Penn in the 1950s, as John said, and the reason it was acquired from the family's vault was because it needed to be preserved, not because they wanted anyone to use the book or add to the book. Its conservation and preservation was privileged over its use, and in a way that is what led to a complete overriding of Pastorius' own pretty radical unsentimentality towards what the book could be. No one added to the notes, and I think what Jantz provided, and it's not necessarily specific to Jantz, but it is something that is part and parcel to academic notions of intellectual property, is he further enshrined the book with a kind of mentality of territoriality. And those who worked on the book were restricted access by Jantz. He very much became a gatekeeper. But I want to really focus on Pastorius's dream that the book could be read and reread, and through repeated readings, cut away at and added to and transformed along with its readers. Because while the name of the book and its appearance, and many of the titles and authors that are featured in keeping with the humanist tradition of commonplacing, as John outlined, are an important part of the book, I also think that much of the motivation between Pastorius's unsentimentality, his sort of resistance to the work as a book, as opposed to as a changing text that could be destroyed in part, I think that comes from his conversion to and his reading of Quaker books. So this is my sort of intro to the Quaker spirituality of the text, which is unsentimental in every way. The Quakers were a radical religious sect that formed in the aftermath of the English Civil War. Their belief in the inner light went much further back, but it allowed for a collapse between human and divine. It allowed for direct communication with God, and it's one in which even Luther, in the sort of early days of the Reformation, found too radical amidst people like Munster and the sort of Anabaptists of sort of 16th century Europe. But those ideas trickled down and sort of became incarnate in Quaker beliefs. The Quakers returned again and again to a line from the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, where he says, "The letter killeth, but the spirit giveth light." Because of that saying, they always found their textual output and their text as secondary to the experience that those texts could produce when read. So George Fox, the founder of the movement, who's heavily commonplaced within the Beehive, wrote, "The spirit was before the letter was." His wife, Margaret Fell Fox, who is basically the architect of the earliest Quaker archives and the common fund by which Quakers published all of their pamphlets, she wrote, "It's blasphemy for you to say the letter is the word, when the letter saith God is the word. The letter is a declaration of the word, a husk." So the Quakers were never troubled by a sense of sanctity in the book itself, the physical book. And Pastorius' use of the word truth in terms of adding or cutting truths within his Beehive is a particularly Quaker way of thinking of information. Quakers describe their outpourings of spirit as truth and convincement. So for instance, in a tract co-authored by Fox in 1653, Fox talked about publishing as a way of putting forth his truth. He wrote, and he used this as a justification for why they published. So he wrote, "We're moved by the immediate spirit of Christ to write, to teach, to exhort, or to put in print. And thou shalt see more papers and more printings. And as the immediate spirit grows, there will be more abominations and filthiness laid open, and all deceit will be discovered, and the truth spread abroad and cherished." That's how the Quakers justified their publications. And they were printing about a pamphlet a week at that point. Robert Barclay, whose Apology became the standard work of Quaker doctrine beginning in the 1670s, again, another book heavily excerpted in the Beehive, wrote that the scripture was only a declaration of the fountain and not the fountain itself. So this amounted to a spirituality in which, as I said, the written or printed word was always secondary to the reader and to the spirit. This also structured the Quaker approach to reading the Bible as it was described in George Fox's journal. The journal was published for the first time in 1694, and again, it's excerpted in the Beehive. But this is Fox describing his sort of creation of the notion of Quakerism in 1648. And he says, "The Lord God opened to me by his invisible power that every man was enlightened by the divine light of Christ, and I saw it through all. This I saw in the pure openings of light without the help of any man. Neither did I then know where to find it in scriptures, though afterwards, searching the scriptures, I found it. For I saw in that light and spirit which was before the scriptures were given forth, that light and spirit by which the holy men of God gave the scriptures forth, that all would know God or Christ, but they must come to that spirit by which they that gave them forth were led and taught." Sorry, there's a lot of giving forth there. In other words, Fox's spiritual awakening was an awakening about how texts are produced. The insight to be gained from reading the scriptures concerned an understanding of the experiences that had prompted those books themselves to be written in the first place. They came from a light and a spirit. It was the giving forth that what mattered, and by extension, imitating that, to print, to write, to exhort, to preach, was an imitation of the authors of the Bible, human authors, he would argue. So the Quaker belief in the spirit over the letter had a few dramatic outcomes. It amounted to what I would think of as an alternative view of the book and the world. One perceived across this Protestant spectrum as heresy, but one not troubled by a contradiction between sacred scripture and its fallen material form, and therefore one open to an expansion in reading outside of the confines of sola scriptura. That, in turn, prompted a profusion of texts written and printed by Quakers, since reading and response were forms of spiritual expression, and in keeping with the example of authors of the Bible. It made Quaker readers into Quaker authors. For example, but on top of that, reading for spiritual necessity didn't even necessarily require the Bible at all. You could do it through reading just about anything, and examples of that arise when you look into pamphlets printed by Quakers. So for instance, William Penn's No Cross, No Crown, the sort of 17th century equivalent to No Pain, No Gain, expanded with each edition in the late 1660s until the close of the century to include new authors, excerpts from scripture, but primarily those excerpts from scripture were overtaken by classical authors, contemporaries, excerpts from Fox's Book of Martyrs, excerpts from nobility, excerpts from Penn's own father. So the text, in other words, was secondary to the reader, and Quakers were wild and wide-ranging in their reading. This environment of reading was one in which individuals were tempered, however, by the emergence of a larger community of readers. So Roger Chartier's work on reading gone rebellious and vagabond, but tempered by constraint, is very important here because it's the communal setting where these wild readers can find some censorship to their actions to an extent. Quakers formed their meetings for worship, but also as administrative hubs, maintaining their records, editing their texts communally, and describing in their meeting minute books the discussions and debates between members about their reading processes. A fine line between censorship and building consensus came out of this environment. Anyone could be a bee, but remember, bees gather honey from a field that they bring together to build something, but spiders gather poison alone. And I think when I first read The Beehive, I read it more as a spider than as a bee, because I read it looking at Pastorius as an incredibly copiously idiosyncratic person. I read it looking for the elements that made it idiosyncratic. But I don't want to risk remembering Pastorius as a spider rather than a bee. The appearance of The Beehive, with its ruled pages and its indexes and honeycombs, belies just how Quaker it is. And I don't just mean that in a good way. As a book, as a book, it is a product of zeal that Quakers were infamous for. And that really gets to why it's so difficult to read and it's impossible to edit. And that zealousness of that led to a prolific production of pamphlets, books, broadsides, was annoying and infuriating to the people that Quakers sassed in their books. So Anglicans, Puritans, I mean, everyone. So Quakers were incredibly frustrating, but also quite intimidating to their critics. So for instance, Francis Higginson did not limit his disgust to printed matter when he complained about Quakers, quote, printing libels and manuscripts that fly as thick as moths up and down the country in 1653. John Brown called them Satan's amanuenses when they visited the Netherlands, where he lived in 1677, and he complained that Quaker writings were a pestilentious cloud of heathenish and hellish darkness, which the devil by the ministry of these locusts hath now exhaled out of the bottomless pit, darkening our horizon and infecting so many, even of such. So another former Quaker, Francis Bogg, wrote in the late 1690s, "Who hath written more than the Quakers? Have they not these 40 years and now laid siege against Christian reputation of both magistrates and ministers enough to infect a nation?" Quaker writings were perceived as excessive and unreasonably so. The bees were treated as a pestilential swarm to a religious culture in which the scripture should have been sufficient. The beehive is also overwhelming in this way. That's the imagery it's named after, and it's an imagery with a dark side. A swarm that you're either in or you're driven away from. So take it or leave it. In manuscript form, it has remained expandable, changeable, and the benefits of that form as a manuscript haven't extended to the form of the printed book. It would not make sense printed as an edited edition as Harold Jantz had envisioned it. But it does make sense digitized. So to somewhat pun on one of Peter's great contributions to the field, Pastorius's writing is not manuscript for print, but it is manuscript for screen. I think that's where John's going to take over and talk a little bit about an initiative that is ongoing to digitize the Beehive.
Yeah, we have a brief coda here that's going to return us to the book. And our sense of being overwhelmed by a solid wall of text to this sense of overwhelming excess. I do think I've heard Roger Chartier say that this Beehive collection is sans queue ni tête, neither tail nor head. And as we've seen, it sits rather uneasily between its place as notes and its place as book. That tension may have been there for Pastorius too, who calls it his English folio Beehive, very much making it book-like, even though it's infinitely note-like. Anne has given us some terms to think about this problem in her wonderful book, Too Much to Know. As a commonplace book, the Beehive may be unwieldy, unrealized, incomplete, an out-of-date scholarly methodology. But as a reference book or even an encyclopedia, and Pastorius did use this term, it might be prescient, ahead of its time, an intriguing predecessor to Chambers or even Diderot. Of course, when faced with this, when it's excess, we have to ourselves read by extracting. We can only take pieces of the Beehive and learn to read them. And now it can actually be done, and Penn students have been doing it. Brooke was among the first to actually read this book, and I hope some of you will come by tomorrow to hear another student, Julia Wang, who's speaking about the Beehive and her senior thesis this year on the Beehive in contemporary literature. This is a page that I'm showing you that an undergraduate class led by Whitney Trittin just tried to read collectively a couple of weeks ago. There's a slightly more doable excerpt of it. Starts with relics, with a reference to old rags, remission, renown, repentance, on and on. Whitney's students were, I think, stunned by looking at this first, amazed at the pages and pages of handwriting that seemed impenetrable. But they made some thoughtful responses, and I'd like to read a couple to you. Charisma Maheshwari wrote this: Pastorius dedicated himself to the act of collation. He filled volumes of scholarly commonplace books. He seemed aware of the legacy he was leaving behind and took incredible pains to make it legible to future generations. He was a man almost obsessed with noting down everything he could glean from the world around him. I understand this obsession, she writes. It seems to be what human beings are fundamentally organized to do, give name to what we see. It's a beautiful summation of some of the problems we've been talking about. Peter was the first, I think, to spark rediscoveries of the Beehive like the one that student just made through exercise in reading. We don't totally get the Beehive, but we can enjoy its crannies and take pleasure in the project of decipherment. So we introduced Whitney students to a digital Beehive project that we've just begun over the last year. And a number of my colleagues, Doug, Lindsay, April, Mariah, Sarah, Eric, have all been working on this project. We've, of course, scanned the manuscript. You can see it, download all the pages online from our Penn websites. It's entirely open access. And you could say the digital photography of the manuscript opens its access, but at the same time it exposes the utter impossibility of digitally navigating this work. We're faced with a mass of pages without end. And the index is only of use to those few, like Brooke, who's figured out how it works. So we're going to acknowledge the impossibility of editing and try to create a series of navigational tools that will get readers to text and make an unnavigable book less so. Students are serving as annotators, creating sections of text and entering main headings and cross-references from pages like this one. We have a lot to enter and a lot of choices to make as we parse Pastorius's methodology. But perhaps one day, here's the utopian vision, we can make an index-to-book relationship that functions for readers seeing the Beehive on a screen, or assemble and examine Pastorius's headings and keywords as a corpus, or even create a dynamic set of cross-references that allow readers to move around the book, much like Artful's digital encyclopédie has helped realize a dream of Diderot and d'Alembert. Another student, Stacy Fox, responded to the project this way. It's humbling to consider that the actual amount of work needed to digitally preserve even a small percentage of humanity's works and present it in an easily readable format already approaches near infinite. It's a very Pastorian sentence there. Another, Anissa Lee, writes, what our foray into digitalization shows is the difficulty of coming up with tools to manage information systems. Librarians must have dialogues with programmers and researchers and historians because there's no right answer, no final solution to the countless problems posed by data management. Those words are important, and now they're part of the story of the Beehive. And this kind of community project is what Brooke has suggested was Pastorius's own vision. We might not live up to Pastorius's lofty ambitions, but we might just do a bit better than his sons did. And we'll leave you here with some last words of Pastorius. Of truth and error comes rest and terror. I hope you found me true, dear reader, so adieu.
Thanks so much to John and to Zach for putting this all together. Thanks always to Peter. And can I just say how amazing this has been, how amazing this is? Peter, look what you've done. This is astonishing. I broke all the rules when it comes to, Peter's rules when it comes to giving talks. I don't have a handout. I don't have any images, or I didn't have any images, and I felt bad about it. So after lunch, I threw together the world's worst PowerPoint, and here it is. But it has exactly 2 images, which I understand is the preferred number, so we're good there. All right, this may sound apocryphal, but I swear that it's true. When I was in graduate school working on my dissertation, I had a dream. In this dream, Peter appeared as a mad scientist. I was surprised, this is true, I was surprised to find myself on an operating table, wide awake, and Peter was performing surgery on me. He was very pleased with himself, and he wanted to reassure me. He said, "It's all right, there's a book in there, we just have to cut it out." I don't normally have such on-the-nose dreams, but there it is. Now, as macabre as this sounds, the affect of the dream was all joy and discovery and humor. It's funny to recount now, but it was even funny within the dream, right? So being Peter's student is a giddy thing. I bring this up because as weird parables go, it's terrifically visceral, right? An aptly material drama unfolding Peter's genius for mentorship and friendship. This also opens up entirely new frontiers in the whole against thinking movement. And I think it speaks to a somewhat mad and manic and extraordinarily generous kind of care. I also bring this up because I want to talk about cutting, reading, and mad belief. 2 of our most incisive and 2 of my favorite early modern scholars have recently returned to early Derrida on the cut. In Shakespeare Cut, Bruce Smith reads the dirty incision in relation to a phenomenology and temporality of the self. This is Smith. I mean, these are kind of elaborate epigraphs. Smith, my sense that I have a self who exists in this moment of time requires some kind of severing or break whereby I step back and consider myself and set now apart from then. He quotes Derrida. The presence of the present only enters squarely on stage, only institutes itself as something face to face, something present, in the play of this cut, this scission. In cultural graphology, Juliet Fleming thinks Derrida in relation to early modern practices of reading and writing. This is Fleming. If cutting has its moods, it is also true that a change of tone or mood is also a cut, a rerouting, a chance to see things differently. Why detail or cut out? It's what everyone does when they write or read, from the Latin to gather or pluck. There's no reading without cutting. This, of course, is Derrida's own point. What affords reading by citations, necessarily truncated clippings, repetitions, suctions, sections, suspensions, selections. Here, I'd like to keep Smith and Fleming on the cut in play as I think about decision, what Derrida calls the sharp blade of decision in relation to conversion and to reading. Histories that address decision often begin their inquiries in the 17th century with figures like Pascal. These works tell a story in which a modern and secular understanding of decision emerges in relation to the development of mathematical probability and statistical inference in Enlightenment thought. Scholarly work that attends to decision pre-Pascal extends this narrative backward by offering genealogies of rational decision-making that excavate early theories of probability in law and medicine, games of chance, the emergence of risk assessment in maritime insurance, the list goes on. That the pre-modern world would have understood decision differently is in a sense the point of these narratives. Here, the modern history of decision is a story of ill-conceived notions of mind's relation to world giving way to reason. It's a story of the bracketing of passions, affect, the body, by rational calculation. Now, in the larger project, I attempt to muddy the waters of such histories by proposing that early modern conversion narratives offer an archive of texts that dramatize decision in relation to both reason and affect in consequential ways. Here, I want to attend to the strange event of conversion, and especially the readerly or textual conversion, by looking briefly at the curious case of William Alabaster. In 1597, William Alabaster was a promising young Protestant divine with a secure living, a bride-to-be, and a bright future awaiting him. Scholars might know him because Spencer championed Alabaster's soon-to-be-completed epic celebrating Elizabeth's defeat of Catholicism. The poem in question was in fact never completed because this promising young man ran into Thomas Wright, then under house arrest in London. As the story goes, the hope was that Alabaster, the brilliant young divine, might convert the old priest. But it seems that Wright converted, or at least contributed to, the conversion of Alabaster. Eventually, Alabaster started to express his views, his new religious views publicly. Interventions were staged. Ultimately detained and arrested, he escaped the Clink in Southwark and traveled to Rome. There, he wrote up a narrative of his turn to Catholicism. The event itself is described in the 4th chapter, of the particular manner of my conversion to the Catholic faith and of Mr. Reynolds' book. Here we discover that it's not precisely the encounter with Wright that produces the conversion experience, but an encounter with one of Wright's books. Finding one day a certain English book lying upon Mr. Wright's table, I took the said book home with me, not suspecting what would follow. Now, as I've suggested elsewhere, the textual conversion was a kind of mini-genre of its own in Reformation Europe as the book increasingly became an agent of change in these narratives. And I might add that the readerly conversion almost always emphasizes the textual cut, the chance fragment or gobbet that becomes differently and suddenly meaningful. Think here of the snippets of speech or song Augustine hears in the famous Tolle Lege episode of his Confessions, as well as the subsequent act of bibliomancy that points him to the selection from the epistle to the Romans that he will take up and read. And as Molly Murray observes, Alabaster explicitly situates this conversion in relation both to Augustine's turn and to the series of conversions, mostly textual, in Book 8 of the Confessions. So having framed his conversion narrative in relation to these and other acts of reading, Alabaster tells his story. To return then to my former narration, I went to my lodging with this little book in my hand, and sitting down after supper on my bedside to spend that idle time, I began to read. I had not read for the space of a quarter of an hour when I was lightened upon the sudden, feeling myself so wonderfully and sensibly changed, both in judgment and affection, as I remained astonished at my true state. I found my mind wholly and perfectly Catholic in an instant, and feeling this with such inward light of evidence as I could not contradict, and with such force of affection as I could not resist. As he's describing what he calls this strange and powerful conversion, Alabaster is at pains to emphasize that the conversion itself is instantaneous, complete, and certain. And one could argue that the crucial feature of this particular conversion narrative is the production of this effusive feeling of conviction. Beyond that, however, when we get to the transformative experience itself, it seems that, as Gertrude Stein said of Oakland, there isn't any there. One of the problems for historical inquiry into conversion is what is essentially a black box effect produced by these narratives. A classic feature of the genre is the failure to describe in any meaningful way the mechanism of transformation. In a sense, this is what conversion narratives often are: stories organized around an essentially unknowable moment of change. We're offered a stage on which the drama will unfold, the fact of the transformation, and the aftermath of the event. All of these beats in the narrative are charged with affect, but the event of conversion is usually empty of anything but affect. In one of his earliest publications, Derrida offers an epigraph from Kierkegaard: "The instant of decision is madness." Undecidability is a consistent thread running through Derrida's work, but this Kierkegaardian notion of the mad event of decision is pursued with a certain vigor in his so-called late work, especially his work on justice and the ethical. For Derrida, decision cannot simply be derived from a rule or a law. It cannot be calculated in advance, because decision is not a function of calculation or deliberation, but an interruption of them. One could argue that conversion narratives like Alabaster's inscribe this Kierkegaardian sense of decision, the notion that the instant of decision is madness. After his conversion, but before any public declaration of faith, Alabaster took some time, an interval or hiatus for which he prayed, 6 months in which to read and to write. In fact, in his return to Cambridge, there's this painfully funny moment when he lists the things that he must do. I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, first, cancel my wedding. Next, buy some books. And he wants to buy these books to start this intense period of reading and writing, this intense period of reflection in preparation for the moment when he goes public, when he makes his turn known. Here's Alabaster describing that interim that he claims as his. "I was wont often to walk into the fields alone, and being then summer, there I would set me down in certain cornfields, and here pass the time, sometimes with internal meditation uniting my will to God, sometimes forming the same meditations into verses of love and affection, as it were hiding of the fire under ashes, with the reading whereof I might afterwards kindle my devotion at new time again. And it did set sometimes a certain strife and wager between my present affections and future, my present persuading to devise sonnets so full of flaming ardor towards Christ, that it should serve for a pattern and sample for the time to come, to conserve my heart and devotion." The marginal note in the narrative reads, "A wager betwixt present and future affections." Now, Alabaster's wager is between the affections of this newly transformed self and those of some future iteration. He will attempt to devise verses that capture this present state of mind so full of flaming ardor. He is, as he writes, hiding the fire under ashes, that is, banking the fire of his present passion for future use, that he might afterwards rekindle his devotion at new time again. So through these acts of writing, he is here both imagining future reading experiences, and thus future versions of himself as reader, and creating the conditions for those experiences and those selves. Now, Alabaster would become famously, indeed infamously, a serial convert. It's tempting to read these anticipations of future selves and the sort of touchingly earnest expressions of both faith and doubt that they voice with this history in mind. It seems that he enjoyed this feeling in this process. But even if we bracket this knowledge, Alabaster's strange wager provides, I think, certain insight into textual conversion. In many conversion narratives, the moment before the moment of conversion is described as one of great anxiety. And I think this points to what Leslie Farber describes as the anxiety which attends willing what cannot be willed, which might suggest both the desire for the change and the complexity of the experience of agency in relation to that desire. And if the instant of decision is madness, to borrow Derrida's slice of Kierkegaardian thought, it's also true that in conversion narratives, especially the textual turn, we often see the soon-to-be converted creating the conditions for the change. On the one hand, conversion narratives perform the Kierkegaardian leap of decision as authenticating. It is precisely the unknowability of the event of conversion and my lack of agency in relation to that event that authorizes the truth of the term. On the other hand, I must be in the right frame of mind, the correct spiritual place for this leap to have taken place. In the textual conversion in particular, there's a strong sense that the ground of the reading self must be properly prepared. So Alabaster's Wager could serve as an emblem of this sort of strange dance of approach and avoidance, the strange experience of decision involved in creating such conditions, involved in creating such transformations, such operations of mad belief. Thank you.
So when Ann Blair very fruitfully asked me, thinking maybe that she was going to be giving an introduction that would tell stories, said, "How did you first meet Peter?" And I said, "I can't really remember, but I know the first time I really saw him in action, which was at a book signing party for, it must have been about the year 2000, for Renaissance Clothing. And both Peter and Annie were there, and they both talked about how committed they were to collaborative research and writing. Annie gave a very nice little talk, and Peter got up and said, "Working with Annie on this book was hell." Are you there, Annie? So you can imagine how I felt when Peter proposed to me collaborating on a book about Benjamin Franklin. But I'm happy to report that it was one of the greatest experiences of my life, and that we remained friends, although there were moments, and we remain friends to this day. And so I want to thank you for that incredible gift to me, Peter. As we were working on this book called Benjamin Franklin, Writer and Printer, Peter became interested, he might say obsessed, with Franklin's handwriting, but only a few bits about it made their way into the book. That's partly because at the library company we have lots of Franklin's printing and lots of printed editions of his writing, but hardly anything written in his hand. Most of the little we do have is in the form of marginalia in books and other printed matter that he owned. So just a few days ago, Peter proposed to me as a retirement project, training other retirees to transcribe marginalia in library company books. It is pretty funny. So certainly Franklin's books would be a good place to start. Well, the most intriguing marginalia we have are on a printed draft of the 1776 Pennsylvania Bill of Rights with Franklin's marginal notes, edits, and emendations. And there it is on the screen. That's what I want to talk about this afternoon. The 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution was the most radical of the state constitutions drawn up in the year or so after the Declaration of Independence. Most of the states created legislatures with upper and lower houses, an indirect election of the upper house, and a strong executive. The Pennsylvania Constitution was completely different. It called for a unicameral legislature directly elected by all male taxpayers, with all legislators elected only for a single term. The executive branch was a committee. It consisted of a 12-person Supreme Executive Council with a president elected by the Assembly and the Council together, meaning that the Assembly was really where the decision was made. And most pertinently here, the Constitution included a Bill of Rights from the very beginning, which anticipated the federal Constitution's Bill of Rights in many respects, but was far more generous in the rights it granted to the people. Franklin was a member of the convention that drafted the Constitution, which embodied many of his ideas about popular sovereignty, and more specifically, he sat on the committee that drafted the Bill of Rights and attended all of its meetings beginning on July 18, 1776. This draft was ordered to be printed on July 29th and was discussed on August 13th, which is probably when these annotations were made. The first article of the draft is remarkable for echoing the language of the Declaration of Independence, which at that point was only 3 weeks old. So what do I have here? So it reads, well, you can read that all men are born equally free and independent, born equally free and independent, and have certain natural, inherent, and unalienable rights, amongst which are the enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. It's much wordier than the Declaration of Independence, of course, with many intensifying and elaborating words added. Language like all men are born equally free and independent might not have been embraced by Thomas Jefferson or other slaveholders. We're used to the idea of the pursuit of happiness as a right, but do we have the right to obtain it? In several places, Franklin tightened up or clarified the language throughout this document without changing the sense, but here he made no edits. The only really substantive changes he made were in Article 5, and they are clearly intended to extend the range of rights and to empower the people. So here's the text as it was printed. The government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community, and that a majority of the community hath an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it in such manner as shall be by that majority judged to be most conducive for the public weal. So it's really interesting how he changed it. So the red is what he added, and the cross-outs are what he took out. So now we see that and there's an extra thing here, not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single man, family, or set of men, blah, blah, blah. And then I think it's really revealing that he crosses out majority. So it's now this is something that has to be done by and for the community and not a majority. And again, community and majority are switched in the last line there. So how did these annotations get here? What was going on when he was writing? The editors of the Franklin Papers wrote, "We cannot be completely certain that the revisions were Franklin's handiwork, rather than his notes of suggestions offered from the floor and adopted in the committee of the whole at one or more of the August meetings. But the latter possibility is remote," they say, and they give one kind of reason, which is just that there was already a secretary for the committee in the room, and why would Franklin be trying to keep track of all this wordsmithing? But they say the principal reason for rejecting this explanation is the stylistic care that went into the emendations and gives them, in our opinion, his particular hallmark. Well, I'm not sure about that, but I buy this argument because, and this is what I want to talk about now, that the argument that the changes that Franklin made, or that were made here, are in accord with Franklin's ideas about popular sovereignty and good government. So let me explain that. So look now at the most radical of all the articles in this Bill of Rights, the last one, that an enormous proportion of property vested in a few individuals is dangerous to the rights and destructive of the common happiness of mankind, and therefore every free state hath a right by its laws to discourage the possession of such property. Yeah, go Franklin. So there are a lot of parallels between the other articles in the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights and those found in other bills of rights adopted during this period, but there's no parallel in any Bill of Rights from this period to this that I know of. And here again, no changes were made. And yet you would expect the debate on this article to have been intense, even in preliminary discussions. So can we assume then that Franklin supported the 16th article or even had a hand in its composition? Well, I think we can. It's not because I believe he was the Bernie Sanders of colonial America. Instead, I suggest that we see it in the context of the diplomatic mission he had been carrying out in London from beginning in 1764, and from which he had just returned in 1775. What he set out to do in London was to convince Parliament to change Pennsylvania from a proprietary colony to a royal colony. He argued that such a change would integrate Pennsylvania more fully within the British Empire and make it more like the other colonies, in the hope that eventually all the colonies would be granted representation in Parliament. This was his long game. What he didn't say publicly was that this huge change would have the effect of depriving the Penn family of their wealth and power, which he thought were indeed dangerous to the rights and destructive of the common happiness of Pennsylvanians. The Penn family was the most obvious example, perhaps the only example, of a few individuals owning an enormous proportion of property in the Commonwealth. This article then seems to me was aimed squarely at the Penn family. The phrase added to the fifth article I mentioned a minute ago about government being instituted for the benefit of the community and not for the particular emolument or advantage of any single man, family, or set of men may also have been aimed at the Penn family. Franklin's animus against that family was intensely personal and not shared by many of his peers, which is perhaps why this last article was the only one to be completely eliminated from the Bill of Rights before it was ratified in the convention on August 16th. There must have been debate on it at a subsequent committee meeting, but no record of that debate survives. By the end of the Revolution, the whole Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 was felt by the now dominant Federalists to be too radical, giving too much power to the people, and it was scrapped and replaced in 1790 by a much more conventional constitution. And of course, by then the Penn family had been well and truly divested of their property and power. But the point I want to leave you with is that in reading Franklin's annotations, it's important to think about the context in which they were made and to have some idea of who was meant to read them and how they were to be used or not used. That seems obvious. But in two of the examples I've given here, in the first and last articles, I think you can see that what is not annotated or amended is actually more interesting than what is. In these cases, then, it's the absence of annotation that's meaningful.
Thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I just want to thank Peter and all the members of the collective based at the Kislak Center and Material Text for having embraced me for no good reason, starting about 15 years ago. I would say I met Peter, I think, at Houghton Library, and if you ever see him in a rare book library, quickly make a beeline to see what he's looking at. I've learned so much about Houghton's collections from watching Peter find tremendous stuff, including the tablets, for example, and now it's a great pleasure to work with him at the Folger in similar circumstances. The other thing, just to pick up on Michael Whitmore's comments about the hedgehog and the fox, Peter combines big picture along with close attention to material and textual detail, and I, as a historian, appreciate how he combines historical contextualization and attention to what a text or an object meant at the time, but also what I identify with the uniquely literary ability to think about what it should mean or can mean to us today. And in particular, concerning note-taking, which is the theme of this particular panel, Peter has really inspired me to think that one of the reasons we study early modern note-taking isn't just to understand how people operated in the past, which is my tunnel vision, but also to think about how we take notes today, and that you can actually get some very good tips on how to manage an excess of textual or other material. So that's been an inspiration, and I think actually that the history of note-taking has been very well served by the digital turn, in that our students now are having to make decisions about how to take notes, and I hope it will be a topic that will prove richly productive for many people for 100,000 years to come, to take the grand perspective. That's my hope for the whole collective, of course. So I just want to touch on a few points in sort of comment fashion, 2 points of scale. The three terrific papers we heard, seems to me, are talking about how, at what scale does a text operate? And I'll start from small to large. So with Jim Kearney's paper, it was a goblet of text, right? So in the bibliomancy of Augustine, it's 2 verses from Romans 13. In Alabaster's case, the conversion is driven by something a little longer. 15 minutes of reading strikes me as maybe 10 pages long. We don't seem to know what book it is, but there's something special about a text that operates in a small, concentrated form, and I'm wondering if one of the reasons we don't want to have too long a text is then it would be open to too many different interpretations, so that it's important that the reader also not anticipate the impact of this reading. This is sort of unintentional reading, and that is the providential reading that, of course, opens up an affect, a just overwhelming feeling that transforms a life, although it's interesting to hear that he's a serial conversion type, so obviously how long this is going to work is the other question. Next up is Franklin, who is reading to edit as part of a collaborative writing process that involves iterations of reading and writing. And the genre is basically administrative. The authors are interested in stating principles to elicit assent, and an effective response, but of course it's mainly crisp and numbered points. And clearly here it seems to me the right size is 1 page. It's designed to be easy and cheap to print and disseminate and post places and so forth. And finally we have Pastorius, who is reading voraciously to practice his English, to enlarge his knowledge, to impart aids to his sons and to future readers. And the right size is seemingly infinite. At about 40 words per line and 120 lines per page, I've got 5,000 words per page, and 2,000 pages, we'd end up with 10 million words, which is about the size of the Magnum Theatrum Vitae of Laurentius Beierlink, who is operating by cutting and pasting from printed books rather than copying it out longhand. So it's fascinating here to see that, the scale is obviously going on forever. And I wonder, what is the size for the internet? Of course, there too, there are costs of going on forever. I'll move to my second point, which is the scale of future at which these different pieces feel they're operating. And here, a slightly different order. So I think Franklin has the short-term goal of getting to a document that people want. It's a working draft, and how the reading and writing are constantly intertwined. But of course, the idea is to build a government that would have a long future through a document that can be interpreted many times, and yet in a way that gathers consensus, that forms structure. Secondly, we have William Alabaster, so I'd like to know what scale of serial conversion we're doing at. He's trying to capture the experience for himself, of his present self for a future self, possibly for future readers, to justify himself from this conversion, which obviously is in very bad odor. So he's not sharing much. It's a black box experience, and I'm wondering why the initial conversion can't be reenacted by this book, right? The text only operates once in this effective way, and then after that, it seems to lose its power. Pastorius invokes the reader of 100,000 years from now, and no, I've never seen anyone operate at that scale in the early modern period. They are notoriously bad at numbers. So Mersenne, for example, says that he thinks there are 50,000 atheists in Paris in 1630, which is, probably a quarter of the population, a bit much. Sébastien Mercier, though, is operating at about a 700-year remove when he writes about l'an 2440, when he's writing in the late 18th century. What does come to mind is Theodor Zwinger, who feels that he's writing for the Last Judgment. He is bringing up human behavior as God will see it. But of course, that's all a question of what's the time frame there. So I leave it to the wonderfully learned and engaged audience today to continue the conversation. I hope we have enough time for that with the speakers. And thanks to Peter for reminding us that reading and writing are constantly intertwined in an ongoing process. Most notes are second-order notes, in fact, so I'm keeping track of some Stella Brasiliana here, and we'll add these. Thanks so much to all of you.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for a few questions.
Hi, Brooke, and hi, everyone. Hello. This is a question that's purely lurid curiosity, which I hope will be expected, which is, what happens in the first 60 pages?
Oh, it's just title page after title page, and indices telling you how to get to the rest of the book. I mean, you could spend a lot of time there.
And some of the poetic games, some of the poetic games, and collections of emblems.
Yeah.
Epitaphs, things like that.
Yeah, it also includes a lot of little excerpts and tidbits about his life setting up camp in Germantown.
So Rebecca just said, so everything and nothing happened.
Yeah.
One of the problems is that the commonplace book of The Beehive, it's a commonplace book, we were looking at this with Anne, actually doesn't start. The actual collection of headings in the traditional commonplace way starts about halfway through. So what does that mean?
Endless preparatory material, endless ways into the book, so that you never get in.
Yeah.
Well, I'm plagued by the Beehive lecture, and so to me, I had a lot of reactions, but the one I guess I want to mention is that there was a tiny, tiny whiff of the Voinovich to it, because it's cryptographic. We heard the word decipher at one point from John, yet it's all in front of you. So that's a very interesting inversion on cryptography. And as a point of information, sort of, but which is kind of relevant to humanities scholars, is that there are social spiders. And if I understand correctly, there's different varieties of them. They're not quite like a hive intelligence, but if I understand correctly, there is an experimental situation in which you can produce a transmission of knowledge by moving an individual into a colony and then removing it, and yet after effects persist for what, in terms of a spider's lifespan, is actually a considerable period of time. So to me, that was kind of, there's a lot about these spiders that is very, very frightening. But that was tantalizing. I asked the person about it, and he either didn't understand me or he replied he has no idea how this transmission happens. It's not genetic. It's not, you know.
You don't have commonplace.
Pardon me?
You don't exchange commonplace.
Well,
No.
I didn't. I tried to offer some suggestions to him.
Texas weaving the web.
Yeah. No, I tried to offer suggestions, and he wasn't buying it. He just didn't know.
Thank you. I think because Pastorius kept bees, he's much more knowledgeable and robust about the lives of bees, and he sort of essentializes about spiders. I absolutely take that on board. Yeah. So we'll need to cut that out and add to it.
I wanted to ask all the panelists about novelty, because I mean, it struck me that the language, starting with you, Jim, is that there's a whole range of sort of words you wouldn't expect to find 100 years earlier. I mean, the notion of actually, you know, the whole concept of pursuing happiness just seems unimaginable in a 17th century context as part of a, you know, so I mean, literally, that's just not, I mean, not doing it, I hasten to add, but putting that in a, you know, that would not be part of a legal document that actually says you have rights to do it. So that strikes me as remarkable. What's remarkable in the case of Pastorius is that, you know, by and large, he's doing the opposite of what the commonplace tradition does, that the commonplace tradition historically has been all about sententiae that are approved from the past. So what you make, you know, what you're actually doing is the Bible's good to do sententiae from, you know, Seneca. There's a lot of obvious sources that you have, Horace. Exactly, the best, but established as the best and known to be the best. And so, you know, and Proverbs will be part of that, so they can either be attributed or not attributed. But Pastorius is mainly dealing with contemporary Quaker literature. The majority of what he wants is contemporary Quakers, and he's not interested, I think, in the classic commonplace book, which is to develop arguments pro and contra. He really he's only interested in pro arguments, pro the positions he believes in. So he doesn't want to give you examples of why slavery might be okay, which very, very typical commonplaces do. They want to give you both sides of a question for a legalistic argument where you could say on the one hand this, on the other hand that. And it seems to me that's a lot of what Anne has opened up in her work, is this question of, you know, the encyclopedia, which is trying to give you every possible angle. Right. As against something that is actually paradoxically, for all its size, still a polemical tool. And I'll just say one thing then, that does seem to me actually to create a link between what Jim's talking about, because we're looking at an unbelievable polemical tool. Whether it's against the Penn family, you know, it's very, very hard to read that last statement today in the moment of Trump.
The Penn family had converted from Quakerism at that point.
Exactly.
So
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
The Quakers are still radical.
Right. But of course, if that was alive, one thing about constitutions that's so important about them is they have force over time. So originary contexts actually are not necessarily the crucial thing. So I just put that as a sort of, because the other aspect of an originary context, it makes you understand why it was done. But once it's there, it's open for interpretation over and over again. And can you imagine that in a constitution today? Would be pretty stunning.
Well, Peter, you probably know a lot more than most people about Franklin's Uncle Benjamin and his enormous collection of radical pamphlets that he that Franklin himself recovered in London, whatever, 70 years after his uncle died. I think that he had access to a somewhat, repressed tradition of popular sovereignty, but also I wouldn't be surprised if words like, the pursuit of happiness is a human right were there in that enormous collection of old pamphlets that Franklin had. It's just that it's not a narrative that we're familiar with.
No, I was going to ask about Franklin's reading, given that reading and writing are inextricably linked, and Jim has just proleptically answered the question, so there's no need.
I just passed it on to Peter, but
I would say to Peter, Pastorius is thoroughly innocent of scholasticism, so he doesn't know that aspect of the commonplacing tradition. He hasn't read Lombard's sentences. No, seriously, he doesn't know Lombard. He's not gonna have read those texts because he's coming from a whole different strain, a kind of quietist strain, and a strain that's not creating that kind of forensic view of theological method, and so that's why he only gives the pro and not the con, it seems to me.
Hi, everyone. I, too, had a question about the Pastorius, because while it's a commonplace, it really strikes me as more of like a record or an archive, especially in the way that it was disbound. I understand that there was an index and there were headings, but because it's disbound, it has this kind of fluidity of movement throughout the text. So I'm wondering if maybe, John, you can speak to this, if the library had any kind of anxiety about imposing a material structure onto something that didn't really want it. Did that go against what was really happening in the Pastorius Beehive or not?
Yeah, it's a great question, Camille. I mean, I think we want there to have been some anxiety because it's such a radical thing to do to any set of materials, and any library conservator in the room will realize that. But there's no evidence of any that I know. Well, there's very little evidence. I don't have a lot. There's no file on this project. Dan's going to say something in a second. But there's a beautiful colophon celebrating the achievement of saving the book in this way.
I would just say that when I got here in 1981 or 2, I was shown that as one of the great triumphs of what the library had been able to do. And it was quite clear that the then staff, Lyman, Nita, and others whom some people here will remember, thought of this as a major achievement in conservation with no sense of what had happened to the object as a result of this. But I also wanted the mic for one other reason, and that is to make one sort of correction to Brooks' comment. The manuscript came here in the 1950s because the family did want it conserved. And of course, it got conserved within an inch of its life. But one of the things that you mentioned in discussing that past was that the family no longer used it. And one of the things that I think John and Lynn know as a story, and I think you know it too, is that the one use it received before you arrived was from the family, many of whose members showed up in the early 1980s to see the manuscript, it was thought, by the then manuscript's curator. What they really wanted to do was to touch the manuscript so that they could chat with Francis Daniel. What they were doing was holding a seance with it, and it was extremely nervous-making.
Do one more. Last question.
It's really, I can't really follow that question. But. So it's merely an information question. You mentioned other, and I'm completely new to the Beehive and to Pastorius, but
It's okay, Jeff. So I was welcome, or
Oh,
that's
thank you.
okay.
You were before that time.
Yes, I'm well before it. But so just hearing about the German context of Pastorius made me wonder whether he had imported other kind of German manuscript practices, including friendship books, Alba Amicorum.
That's also a section just after the first 60
Yeah,
pages.
So it's in this text. It's not a separate album that he carried around with him and got
He didn't keep a
autographs.
friendship album exactly in that way.
No, but it's a form that is
but the-
that does exist within the Beehive.
I mean, one thing we couldn't really touch on is the really interesting and complicated interplay between his manuscripts and his copying from book to book. The Historical Society of Pennsylvania has a notebook that he used to draft things that went into the Beehive. He states that very clearly in it. So there is a lot of working between manuscripts. And yeah, I think sort of like Michael's question, there are some complicated intellectual passages here. He's a converted pietist. He's trained, his father was a lawyer. It's not completely
But there are
true,
many similarities between pietism and Quaker. I mean,
Yeah.
and closeness between.
But I mean, that's not the only thing he's bringing with him.
Right.
I'd say that more as response to Michael. There's actually a wider intellectual sort of suitcase.
Part of the reason I ask is because I think the friendship albums are so multiply collaborative. They have the autographs of other people in them and inscriptions of other people, but they also have quotations selected by other people, but included in one's own notebook. And so it seems quite different from what you showed.
No, I actually think it's a good point because there is stuff like that. One of the pieces I'm interested in, which I didn't talk about, is a separate manuscript that has a place in the Beehive called the Shipmate Ship, which is a tribute by Pastorius to the daughters of some of the people he immigrated with, Rachel Preston, Sarah Hill. So to a set of very important Quaker women who he's in absolute loving community with. And at their deaths, he writes a memorial epitaph in several of his manuscripts. So, I mean, there's a kind of friendship recording all the way through.
Occasionally there are sections or combs that contain his transcriptions of things he had inscribed or letters he had written to others as well. So he'll write the poem that he inscribed in a book that he gave someone as a gift, but he'll record it in the Beehive. So it has
So
something
I
of
think
that.
you're
It's very much about the social life
absolutely right.
of the colony,
Thank you.
but drawn from the tradition that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you to our panelists. Let's take a shorter than expected 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene.
Panel 4 is entitled Sheets, Pamphlets, Books. Diane Mitchell's up first.
I'm just going to jump right in here so as to get to the cookie sooner. Okay, so between the sheets, see if this works. All right, so in 1613, Frances Stanley Egerton, soon to be Countess of Bridgewater, took a sheet of paper, folded it in half, inscribed a message on the front of the first leaf, secured it with a series of further folds and some sealing wax, and sent it to her friend, the Warwickshire gentlewoman Anne Lady Newdigate. Letters between women represent only a small proportion of surviving Renaissance correspondence. But what really makes this letter stand out is what we find quite literally inside, inscribed on that capacious but rarely used interior epistolary space that we might call between the sheet. So on the back of the letter's first leaf, which you can see here, on what would have been, before the removal of the letter's address leaf, one of its two inner pages, is a poem. Then my life's comfort will appear, that I to thee am truly dear. Dearer thou art than life to me. Increase my heart's comfort of thee. So one of the few people to write about this surprising and modest verse is James Daybell, who identifies Egerton as its author, and who writes of this combined letter and lyric. An epistle to Anne Newdigate from Lady Frances Egerton ends with a verse of friendship. And what I'd like to ask today is whether we can or should in fact, read this poem as a straightforward expression of the same-sex affection said to suffuse the letter itself. For if the lyrics inscription on the rarely used and materially hidden inside of this letter might seem to offer us intimate access to the equally interiorized hearts that the poem describes, the medium of this letter, I'm going to suggest, brings us up short at every turn. So let's look first at the letter, which is written in Egerton's mercifully clear hand. So I will read it. Sweet madam, you needed not have pleaded your excusal for your remissness in performing your promise to her whose thoughts have conceived so good an opinion of you that they will not, upon so slight an occasion, entertain any suspicion of your love, but rather make very favorable constructions of the causes that may oppose your desires to express your good wishes, which I shall truly believe for the kind respects you have ever showed me. In other words, it's all good. I thank you for the book you sent me, which I hope will make me so skillful against I see you that I shall have cause to acknowledge myself your scholar. Frank commends her to her servant with many thanks for her token, and hath sent her another to wear for her sake. And likewise I cannot forget my kind remembrance to your daughter, wishing you all much happiness, and myself some good occasion to show that I am your very loving friend, Francis Egerton, York House, May 4th, 1613. And we see a little postscript here. I have sent you a black chain by this bearer and a bracelet to your daughter. So there are a lot of things we could say about this letter. First and foremost, that the Renaissance rediscovery of an intimate epistolary style marked by spontaneity and particularity is not wholly in evidence here in this letter. That's not to say that there isn't intimacy. We might notice, for instance, the letter's salutation, sweet madam. Interestingly, the sweetness that Jeff Maston has identified as crucial to what he calls the syntax of affective male relations in this period would also seem to obtain for women letter writers, because Anne Newdigate's correspondence turns out to be full of sweets. So Arabella Stewart writes to thank you, sweet Mrs. Newdigate, for your fine cuffs. The much maligned maid of honor, Mary Fitton, opens a letter to her older sister, Anne, with the salutation, sweet sister, if I should paint my love in words, it were very little to be respected, which is how I write to my sister. Anne's kinswoman, Lucy Percy, uses the term sweet 3 times in a single short letter, twice calling Anne sweet cousin, and concluding by desiring most earnestly your sweet presence. But what's remarkable about Percy's use of sweet, however, is the way in which it extends into the outer, more visible spaces of the letter. And if we turn over Percy's message, the front of the leaf, we actually find a superscription. This is, I think, totally amazing. To my sweet sweeting, Mrs. Anne Newdigate. Okay, and the lack of further geographical instructions on this address, I think suggests, pretty sparse, suggests that the aristocratic Percy was using a servant, an employer, not a public carrier, who she probably wouldn't have employed much in any event. But this superscription nonetheless represents a semi-public performance of sweetness, one which might prompt us to question whether the intimacy ascribed to terms of endearment does in fact derive from its privacy or its removal from the common purview. So other features of Egerton's letter make it an unsatisfying expression of intimacy, particularly in the early modern sense of that term, as that which is most innermost or deep-seated. For if the letter affords a kind of access to Egerton herself through her use of her own hand, as I mentioned, rather than that of a scribe, it also draws attention to its own mediatedness in a manner that seems to undermine this choice. So there's the weird section, for instance, in which Egerton appears to slip into the third person. And I'm really puzzled by this, and if you think that I'm reading this wrong, please tell me afterwards, because I find it really confusing. So she says, Frank commends her to her servant, with many thanks for her token, and hath sent her another to wear for her sake. And Egerton here could be referring to her daughter, who's also called Frances. But if we look at the postscript, I have sent you a black chain by this bearer and a bracelet to your daughter. This seems to suggest that she, Egerton, is the Frank who hath sent her, in other words, Anne, who's weirdly called her servant, which I don't totally understand, another token. So, talk to me about that later. Egerton's choice of a chain, I do think is possibly important as a gift because it could symbolically indicate her desire to sustain links with Newdigate. But even this gift is mediated here by the unnamed bearer, who is, pragmatically speaking, the gift's first real recipient, the person that it is handed to first. So all of this is to say that by the time we get to the rhyme inscribed inside the letter, we ought to be attuned to the ways in which this artifact actively resists an epistemology of directness or interiority. But there's another reason why we should hesitate to read these couplets as an unmediated expression of Egerton's love for or friendship with Anne Newdigate. Namely, it was Anne Newdigate herself, not Egerton, who wrote these lines. So the pages of received letters were, it turns out, a frequent medium for Anne's writing. On the superscription page of a letter from her powerful uncle Francis Fitton, Anne begins drafting a response, reporting the shocking news of Anne of Denmark's self-imposed miscarriage. And you can see the similarity of the handwriting here, even though this draft of a letter is much earlier than Egerton's letter. This is relating to events even before the coronation of James. Elsewhere, the relationship between the correspondence Anne receives and what Anne chooses to write on it becomes more oblique. So a decade later, near the elaborately decorated superscription or address of a florid letter she received from Francis Beaumont of Bedworth, not the poet, a letter which invites the recently widowed Anne to be mine only best lady above all others. Anne inscribes what looks like a grocery list. So we can see here black pins, black sleeved silk, white thread, wax sizes or candles, and toothpicks right next to the address. And she does it again on the verso of the first page of yet another amorous letter from Beaumont. So what you're looking at on the right is the front page of his letter. On the left is the back of that page. It's upside down. As you can see, she's turned it over. And you can see she's written wire whipped with black, other wire 6 knots, 200 of jet buckle, like the pattern, such a black purse as my sister's, my hat, a pair of hangers for Jack to his girdle. It was bought at the new shop by Ludgate, a pound of black currants, 6 pounds of figs, etc. And she kind of keeps going here. So Beaumont's numerous letters to Anne seem to have offered a convenient means for Anne to plan her shopping. And in fact, if we look at Anne's meticulous account books from this period, we can actually see her purchasing some of the very items she records on the blank spaces of her suitor's mail. And if you are interested in account books and you would like a Dropbox file full of images of this, and you're playing Stolly Brass Bingo, let me know. I'll send it to you. Okay, so let's come back to Egerton's letter to her friend. So at some point, perhaps shortly after receiving it, perhaps later on, Anne Newdigate inscribed a poem in the open space between her friend's message and its superscription. Should we therefore interpret Anne herself as the poem's I, her correspondent as the thou, who is dearer than life to her? Possibly, although the syntax of the opening couplet makes it hard to know just what or who will appear and what difference its appearance makes to the speaker's own desirability. More importantly, though, I've been trying to say that any directness of expression, which the poem's epistolary context might seem to afford to this poem, is undermined by the stubborn mediatedness of the letter itself, a mediatedness which even extends to its inconsistent use of the pronouns I and you. There is something here, however, that I want to call intimacy. It's just that what I'm proposing is that the material forms of ephemeral lyrics like this one offer glimpses of intimacies that emerge precisely through their refusals of immediacy, closeness, privacy, and interiority. What Edgerton's letter ultimately represents for Anne Newdigate is a writing surface. And if our hope is to locate intimacy between two women at a distance of 400 years, it's to such surfaces and not to imagined emotional depths that we'll have to look. Thank you.
So I was one of Peter's undergraduate students. I had taken a Renaissance poetry class with him in my junior year, which was an amazing experience. And then as sort of a paradigmatic example of Peter's generosity, he then invited me to take an independent study class with 3 other students that he was organizing the following fall, in which we wrote 10 papers each. And so, and so looking back, it's things I haven't done as a professor. Decided to do an independent class where I'm going to have a lot of grading on top of my regular courses. In that, we read The Materiality of the Shakespearean Text, which was one of those transformative essays for me that sort of helped launch me on the path that I'm now on. And so, like, if you don't like this talk, Peter, you're kind of to blame for what comes out. But this isn't on the bingo sheet, but I ended up in graduate school with David Kasten as my advisor. And so one of the other books that I read around that time was the edited collection that Kasten and Sallybrass did on staging the Renaissance, which was itself just sort of an amazing, sort of exciting book when I read it at that time. And so anyway, that's sort of why I'm here right now. The title of my talk today is Big Jobs, Printers and the Publication of Long Books. In case you don't immediately recognize it, my talk was inspired by Peter's seminal 2000 essay from 2007, Little Jobs, Broadsides and the Printing Revolution. In it, he makes many important arguments, but 2 in particular about printers. First, he begins with the counterintuitive claim that printers do not print books, they print sheets. Mark your bingo sheets. By this he means binders turned printed sheets into pamphlets and books, and booksellers sold those pamphlets and books to customers. But printers were centrally concerned with the production of printed sheets. Even when printers themselves may have been involved in the gathering, folding, stitching, and binding of sheets, or in selling publications to book buyers, the main concern of their printing houses was the printing of sheets. Peter then goes on to make a second important point. Little jobs, or jobbing printing, was a crucial part of the business of printing, one that is now all but invisible to modern scholars because these little jobs have largely disappeared from the surviving historical record. What were these little jobs? And this is where the pleasure of the list comes in. Ballads, religious tables, indulgences, proclamations, petitions, briefs, bills of adventure, bills of mortality, blank forms, recognizances, licenses, indentures, labels, bookplates, receipts, tickets, playbills, advertisements, oaths, charts, epitaphs, portraits, and so on. According to Peter, these types of little jobs provided a crucial source of revenue for printers who would interrupt their work on bigger jobs, bigger projects like books, in order to print them because, he suggests, little jobs regularly injected cash into the notoriously undercapitalized book trade. Jobbing printing, especially those documents that required printing on only one side of a sheet, were in fact so lucrative in early modern England that they were effectively controlled by printers through several monopolies. As Peter details, these monopolies were part of bitter legal and trade disputes in the 1610s through the 1630s, a further testament to their profitability for printers. One of the reasons that Peter's essay is so valuable is that it makes a major contribution to our understanding of the business of printing in early modern Europe. For all the insights of analytical bibliographers and the historians of printing have produced about the wages of compositors, pressmen, and correctors, about shared printing, printing by forms, and seriatim printing, about compositor practices, type cases, broken type, and press correction, about the concurrent printing of several different projects at once, to name a few. We know less about the business of printing houses in early modern London than we might assume. We tend to think of publishers, who are usually booksellers, hiring printers to print sheets that would be turned into books. Printers would charge these publishers a relatively standard rate for the cost of printing a certain number of sheets, to which they would add a relatively standard markup of around 50%. There were presumably differences in the quality of workmanship associated with different printing houses, and therefore different printing houses probably charged somewhat different rates, especially for different kinds of jobs. But that kind of information is now largely lost to us. What this model assumes, however, and what must have been at least generally true, is that printing houses relied on volume. The more sheets they printed, the more successful printers could become. Printing more sheets, in theory, would have generated more revenue and thus greater profits. Printers, however, did more than just print. They also published books. Some probably employed binders. Most probably owned warehouses for storing printed and unprinted sheets. And some, if not most, operated small retail bookshops. Their businesses were not restricted solely to printing sheets for other stationers. In part because printers were engaged in a variety of business activities, we still have large gaps in our understanding of the business of printing houses. How easy or difficult was it to run a profitable printing house in early modern London? Did printers have particular kinds of specializations in the ways that publishers did? Were printers more or less active as publishers compared to booksellers or other stationers? What kinds of economic or ideological connections were there between the books they printed and published for themselves and the books they printed for others? If printers printed sheets, not books, what kinds of print jobs were their core business? Where did most of the sheets they printed end up, in what kind of publications? I do not have answers to all of these questions, but in the rest of my talk today, I want to build on Peter's pioneering work and begin to address some of these issues about the business of printing. There are three main points I want to make. Point number one, big jobs were at the heart of the business of printing. Although printers relied on jobbing printing and printed many short publications for booksellers, most of the sheets they printed were for big books. Take a look at figure one. It shows all, this is from the STC. If you wanted to ask about methodology, you can, but basically it shows all extant publications in the STC printed from 1561 to 1640 for the English book trade, STC books, that were intended for retail sale, what Zachary Lesser and I have called speculative editions. It breaks down these editions into three different categories based on length: 9 edition sheets or less, 10 to 49 edition sheets, and then 50 edition sheets or longer. And if you're not familiar with the term, edition sheets are the total number of sheets that would have gone into one copy of an edition. Perhaps the most surprising thing that this graph shows is the discontinuity between the length of most speculative editions, 9 sheets or less, and the length of books for which the greatest number of sheets were printed, over on the right, 50 sheets or longer. Over half of extant speculative editions were 9 sheets or less, but the sheets required to print those editions made up only about 10% of all the sheets printed for speculative publications. Conversely, big jobs, books that were 50 sheets or longer, make up less than 10% of all the extant editions, but the sheets in these editions make up over 52% of all the edition sheets printed. There were thus many more small books and pamphlets published, but most printed sheets went to big books. What happens, you might ask, if these figures factor in all of the varieties of non-speculative printing that survive from this period? Print jobs that overwhelmingly tended to be short. Think of proclamations, visitation articles, petitions, etc. We find much the same pattern. Short works now make up 57% of all extant printed editions, but 52% of all edition sheets still go to big books. Big jobs were where most printed sheets would have ended up. The same pattern emerges even if we include lost editions. This next series of graphs is for 1580 to 1640, a period for which I've calculated what I think are reasonable estimates for lost editions. And this is from a 2016 essay in a collection co-edited by Zachary Lesser. Figure 3 begins again only with speculative editions. And we again see that 52% of sheets were for books 50 sheets or longer for big jobs. Figure 4 then includes non-speculative editions, and we see basically the same pattern. This next graph, figure 5, now includes the estimates I calculated for probable lost editions from 1580 to 1640, excluding single-leaf publications like ballads, which I'll get to in a second. These estimates bring in over 6,100 additional editions, most of which would have been very short. As we can see, the percentage of short editions rises to almost 65% of all publications. Yet almost half of all edition sheets, 48%, would still have been for big books. Finally, what happens if we include lost editions of single-leaf publications, like ballads or the many types of jobbing printing that existed? I have no idea how many editions of ballads or other single-leaf publications or other forms of jobbing printing may have been printed and are now lost. But figure 6 shows what these breakdowns would look like if there were an average of 400 editions of single-leaf publications every year, over 24,000 total. And this is a somewhat arbitrary number, but I just wanted to do it for illustrative purposes. The percentage of short publications now rises to over 80% of all editions, whereas big books represent only 3.6% of all editions. These big jobs, however, still compose 46% of all printed sheets. And basically, in the other graphs, half the books, 50 sheets or longer, where most printed sheets would end up. In this model, instead of being 50 sheets, it's 40 sheets. Half of all the printed sheets would have been in publications 40 sheets or longer. So it just moves it slightly down. What this series of graphs demonstrates is that the number of printed sheets required for big jobs was so great that even factoring in over 6,100 probable lost editions and over 24,000 lost single-leaf editions only slightly affects the distribution of printed sheets. Printers printed sheets, and most of the sheets they printed seem to have been for big books. These graphs lead me to my second point. Even though most printed sheets were destined for big books, most speculative editions were much shorter, 9 sheets or less. This is where the businesses of bookselling and printing diverge. The business of bookselling centered on selling books and pamphlets that were predominantly short, as you can see here in figure 7, which is all the speculative editions from 1561 to 1640 in like 5-sheet intervals. The business of printing, conversely, centered on printing sheets for books that were quite long. The centrality of big books to the business of printing even affected the kinds of books published by printers. This is my third and final point. Printers specialized in the publication of large volumes, as you can see here in figure 8. The lower orange line represents the percentage of all London speculative editions, i.e. that a London stationer published, at least in part, and then by a printer, at least in part by a printer. As you can see, that percentage drops from 75% of all editions in the period of 1561 to 1575 to 24% in the last period of 1621 to 1640. What this means is that printers were involved in the publication of a smaller and smaller proportion of the editions brought out by London stationers. But now look at the blue line. It represents a percentage of very long books, those 100 edition sheets or longer, that were published by London printers, or at least in part published by them. And these long books represent like the tail end of all the books that are being published, only 4% of them. And most of these are books that you could probably imagine. 2/3 of them were collectively religious treatises, Bibles, law books, and prose histories. But here too we see a decline, but one that is not quite as steep. More important, what the blue line shows is that throughout these 8 decades, London printers consistently published a much higher proportion of very long books. Even in the last period of 1621 to 1640, when printers were publishing only about 1/4 of all editions, they were still responsible for publishing over half of the very longest books. The key point is this: not only was the business of printing concentrated in big books, but the publication of big books was concentrated among printers. I want to end with a few final caveats. My claims about the printing and publishing of big books are based on the London trade as a whole. Not every printing house relied equally on printing sheets for big jobs, nor did every printer regularly publish big books. The Aldi printing house, for instance, which was run from 1560 into the 1630s by John Edward and then Elizabeth Aldi, almost never published or printed editions that were longer than 50 sheets, like 7 out of close to 800 editions. But the basic pattern of printing output I've traced here seems to have been almost always true for individual printers. The majority of printed sheets they produced were for the longest editions that they printed. More generally, because printing more sheets seemed to have led to greater profits, it is not surprising that most printing houses printed and also published big books. Big jobs were at the heart of the business of printing. Thank you.
So Peter doesn't know this, but this paper, like the whole event today, is really his fault. Several years ago, when I was starting on and struggling with a dissertation on 17th century and English cultures of mourning and commemoration, I mentioned to Peter that I had been looking at some broadside elegies printed in New England. And Peter, in his characteristically generous and generative way, said, that's a great idea, why don't you keep doing that? And he also made some kind of comment to me, it's been lost in time, I wish I could remember exactly what he said, but something to the effect of that these elegiac writings in New England were quite important, were quite prevalent. I've sort of puzzled over that question of importance and prevalence quite a bit subsequently, and that's essentially the meditation that I'll be engaging with in this paper today. And I'm going to try to think in a Stallybrassian fashion through what it means to make the claim that broadside elegies were a common feature of New England printing, and I'm also going to try to investigate what are the actual material objects that sustain such a general claim. As I've discovered, the broadside elegy has quite a privileged, if also a bit of a vexed position in American bibliography and literary history, which goes back to the turn of the 20th century realization that a number of these texts do survive from the 17th and early 18th centuries, which is an era of otherwise very low survival rates and also a very limited literary production in New England. So for early 20th century literary historians like Thomas Goddard Wright or Samuel Eliot Morison, the survival of this scattered corpus was vital evidence of the innate literary instincts of the early colonists, if it also showed their aesthetic inferiority in relation to England. For the early bibliographers like Worthington Chauncey Ford or slightly later George Parker Winship, these texts moved between the exceptional and the exemplary. Broadside elegies were the earliest examples of personal or non-governmental printing in the colonies, the first examples of job printing, also perhaps the first examples of literary production and print. We now understand that the colonists were actually engaging in a much wider variety of literary production in manuscript in the 17th century, but the printed elegy has continued to serve as an emblematic Puritan form. So in recent works by Matthew Brown or Jeffrey Hammond, it has been recast through anthropological or sociological lenses of ritual as a key into Puritan reading cultures or the New England tribalistic form of social organization. So this narrative of slightly vague but pervasive presence of early American broadside elegies has moved between discourses of bibliography, history, and literature, I think with each discipline confirming the other's conclusions. I'm going to try to disrupt this circuit a little bit and suggest some alternative formulations of print and literary history that might take its place, although part of what I'll emphasize is that we actually don't know too much about what the early press in New England was printing. Even so, I'll make some provisional claims that the nature of the early Cambridge press operating in Harvard Yard during the period 1638-1675, the only press in the colonies, was probably not actually printing any broadside elegies. That the emergence of the printed elegy in New England was instead tied to specific political and institutional changes, the catastrophic loss of King Philip's War in 1675-76, and the opening up of the first independent print shop in Boston, not Cambridge, at the same time as the war was ongoing. Finally, I'll suggest that even before the turn of the 18th century, an active local Boston and New England historical culture was at work producing an image of its past, in part through simulations of imagined earlier 17th century prints. And I'm going to try to very quickly, in abbreviated fashion, move through 3 moments in time where I think an idea of what the American elegy is was formulated. So one of the first key moment I'll focus on is in 1922, although I'll start with a poem that goes back to 1682. This is the locus classicus for the presence of American elegy as a kind of index of American history. This is Cotton Mather's 1682 elegy on Urian Oaks, the opening of the poem. Cotton embalms great Hooker, Norton him, and Norton's hearse does poet Wilson trim with verses. Mitchell writes a poem on the death of Wilson, and when Mitchell's gone, Shepherd with funeral lamentations gives honor to him, and at his death receives the like from, like Marrow, lofty strain of admirable oaks. And at this point, Cotton Mather inserts himself into the chorus, as he puts it, with his own elegy for oaks. This is clearly a very powerful statement of historical continuity and intergenerational transfer. Though Mather is actually doing some rather slippery things with time. This might seem like a sort of neat sequence of generations, but there's actually just really 2 historical moments, one from the very early history of the colony and one that is much closer to the time that Mather is himself is writing. Obviously, Mather is also writing from a retrospective position, and the destiny of this sequence of elegies would not be apparent at the moment of Cotton and Hooker in the 1640s. So these verses have a long history in American literary history. They were picked out already in the 19th century as an important history of the first generations of American writing. In the 1920s, they were also picked out as an apparent record of lost broadside issues, right? So the idea that each one of these elegies must have been printed as a broadside and subsequently lost. In fact, Mather was almost certainly not working from a file of broadsides, but rather from copies of these poems that were published in printed books. In particular, one important source, Nathaniel Morton's Landmark History, New England's Memorial, published in 1670. This is also an important precedent for what I'm going to be calling the historical printing of elegies in broadside format. Morton has inserted the elegies that Mather is referring to into the text of his chronological history. And Morton, as what we know of the sources that he was using to compile his history was that they were manuscripts. Morton himself was the secretary of the Plymouth colony and nephew of its governor. He was sort of at the center of a hub of manuscript networks. However, in 1922, Worthington Chauncey Ford, a rather authoritative figure, president of the American Historical Association, curator of manuscripts at the Library of Congress, also chief statistician for the US State Department. In publishing his chronologically ordered bibliography, broadsides, ballads, etc., printed in Massachusetts, 1639 to 1800, Ford decided that the source for Morton's interjections into his history must be some source other than manuscripts. And in particular, again, he came up with the idea that these poems must be lost broadside issues. And on the right-hand side, I've shown how he's actually filled out the early years of the early years of New England printing with these supposed lost broadside issues. If you take those out, there's actually extremely few texts that would be in his bibliography. If we set aside all these conjectured lost prints for which we may have texts or titles, all this conjecture of a lost corpus of broadside printing from the early Cambridge press has been premised on just 2 surviving prints. A half-sheet issue on the 1667-68 death of Lydia Minot of the prominent Minot family, and an even smaller slip on the left on the 1657-58 death of the relatively unknown Joseph Briscoe, although the author of the poem, John Wilson, was an important early leading minister of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Both these prints, however, date from the early 18th century. And here I'm going to actually very quickly compress a long history of bibliographic fumbling around these texts. I'll just highlight important key figures who have questioned the dating of these texts before, which actually goes as far back as 1930 in a publication by Elizabeth Winslow. I should also acknowledge Keith Arbour, who also did the key work for the Minot Elegy in an article published in 2000. Also, Hugh Amory, who didn't quite get the Briscoe text right, but at least sort of raised the right questions in looking at it. In terms of the Minot Elegy, it's actually quite easy to date this piece. This distinctive, rather crude headband with a funeral cortege being led by the figure of death, who is telling us to remember him, and in 2 languages. This woodcut can be traced to the Boston print shop of Bartholomew Green in the early 18th century. If you look at the AAS Dictionary of Colonial Printers' Ornaments, you'll get 1 entry for what are actually 3 different versions of this cut. But the most important thing, I think, is that the very earliest version of this cut at the top has an untrimmed far right edge. If you can see underneath, there's a subsequent trimmed version of this woodcut, and that is the one that is used on the Minot text. In terms of the slip on Joseph Briscoe, it's a matter of the title font. Actually, the name Joseph Briscoe itself has been printed in using Joseph Moxon's Great Canon Roman, with the punches for which were not cut until about 1668, so over a decade after this print was supposedly published. And Moxon's type, I believe, doesn't show up in New England until about 1683, so quite a bit later. Here, my own bibliographic inadequacies come to the fore. I don't have a secure dating for the Briscoe print, though I believe it was like the Minot text issued from the print shop of Bartholomew Green, though somewhat earlier, maybe around 1715, 1720, rather than 1730. Even those scholars who have raised questions around the dating of the Briscoe and Minot texts have always assumed that they must have reprinted earlier lost 17th century broadsides. But why should we assume that such earlier prints ever existed? Broadside elegies have their important place in the history of American bibliography precisely because they are exceptions to the general rules of the early Cambridge press, right? The Cambridge printers were salaried, they did not own their own presses, otherwise they do not seem to have been engaged in job printing, and they really didn't produce literary works. Our modern understanding of the Cambridge presses, and here Hugh Amory gets the lion's share of the credit, is that they were official organs for Harvard College, also the colony government, and also the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel based in London. The early Cambridge press was frequently inactive, especially in the period before 1670, and even after then was employed for highly selective and specific purposes, college theses, government printing, and Indian printing, all of which were kept under rigid theocratic control. Surely then, if there are no surviving imprints and no other external evidence for the printing of these broadside elegies, our assumption should be that the early Cambridge press was not printing this kind of ephemera. Should we approach the American elegy from this different perspective, I believe a very different literary history might emerge. In 1676, at least 4 distinct broadside elegies were printed that now survive. All of these were issued from the newly opened First Boston Press of the maverick entrepreneur John Foster, who had a varied career as a writing master, portrait painter. He was the first self-taught woodcutter in the colonies and also the first independent printer, again self-taught. And I've put his tombstone inscription up top there, "Skill was his cash." The first of Foster's surviving 1676 prints, a funeral elegy on the death of the younger John Winthrop, a son of the leading founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, openly advertises its printed status with the anagram, John Winthrop, oh, print woe nigh. A second broadside published as a sequel opens with the poetic line by the poet Benjamin Johnson, another black parenthesis of woe, the printer wills that all the world should know. I think this is quite actually an extraordinary statement. This print is telling us that something about the arrival of a new kind of printing and also a new printer in Boston. The context for Foster's 1676 elegies was the devastating loss of King Philip's War, by many measures the most violent conflict America has ever fought. In April 1676, when Foster was producing these elegies, the war was for the first time shifting in favor of the colonists, following the Native Alliance's destruction of over half the colonial settlements in New England and the push of remaining English survivors to the coastline. The Native strategy seems literally to have been to push the English back to England. Another of Foster's elegies from the same year participates in the shaping of a new culture of mourning and commemoration in a novel way. This print is a poem that describes itself as written many years since on the 1649 death of John Winthrop Sr., so the father of the Winthrop and the earlier 2 elegies I showed you, and John Winthrop Sr., the leader of the fleet that first brought large numbers of English colonists to New England. And this print bears no date of issue, but I think it's fairly clearly intended to be a part of a series with the early two prints. I'll just conclude by saying at the point of what I think is the emergence of the American broadside elegy, we see that it's working not only as a means for measuring and managing present loss, but also for weaving mourning and desires around lost origins. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'm going to serve today as the counterpoint to what Sim claimed at the beginning of the day was Peter's advice on giving talks, short, 2 slides, 1 point. Because as we all know, Peter has never limited himself to 2 slides. And following Peter's practice, I've got 26. As we all well know, Peter is a great publicity machine, publicizing other people's projects and sometimes even making them his own. This, of course, simply means that you are now collaborating with him on making new discoveries and sharing them with others. And these collaborations are always fruitful and generous and fun. For me, these collaborations revolve around canvassing books, Bibles, and most recently, a project on Walt Whitman, about which you can ask me more later. For now, I will combine the first 2 of these topics and tell you something about a canvassing book for Bibles. 19th century America saw the rise of a new kind of subscription publishing and a new approach to marketing. Once a relatively genteel means of seeking financial support for an expensive publication project with uncertain sales prospects, subscription bookselling expanded during the 19th century into a door-to-door solicitation of commitments to purchase particular titles, not just prior to publication, as had been the case with earlier subscription ventures, but at any point in the publication process. This uniquely American publishing phenomenon grew out of a confluence of economic circumstances and opportunities, tied in part to expansion southward and westward, and to improving communication networks made possible by the development of stagecoach and later railroad routes. Which one? That one? Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. With the growth of industry and the development of faster and better machines for producing goods over the course of the 19th century, merchandise became cheaper and more plentiful. This was true in the publishing industry as well, where new types of mechanized printing presses, first the cylinder and then the rotary press, greatly speeded up the printing process. In addition, new production methods for binding books more quickly made the timeline for getting new books to the market shorter and shorter. Businesses sought new avenues through which to sell these goods, including books and other reading material, not only in the cities, but also in the hinterland. The increasing availability of inexpensive print, combined with rising literacy rates and an expansion of leisure time, were behind the growth in the market for magazines and newspapers as well as books, with publishers competing for the public's pennies, dimes, and dollars. This competition led some enterprising publishers to devise new strategies for creating ever greater demand, using door-to-door solicitation by salesmen and women, referred to as agents, and then feeding them with more and more reading material, which they hyped to the agents and through the agents to the buyers. Many of the names appearing on title pages as the publishers were more like agencies, dependent on a real publisher usually located in one of the major East Coast cities like Philadelphia to provide them with the actual books. The books themselves were often cheaply printed on poor paper while being marketed as high quality and priced accordingly. The Bible, which remained a bestseller throughout the 19th century, came to the attention of certain subscription publishers, following upon the success of Harper's Illuminated Bible. In the 1840s, the trade publisher Harper & Brothers was instrumental in developing the prototype of the new large, heavily illustrated Bibles, which came to be referred to as family Bibles, and which would become so popular in the decades to follow. However, as we can see here, Philadelphia publisher and bookseller Matthew Carey had already, at the very beginning of the 19th century, described some of his own Bibles as family Bibles. Carey's family Bibles were illustrated with full-page engravings and additional material, including a printed page for family records, something that became an essential part of the later family Bibles. These printed forms, one of Peter's favorite topics, used for recording births, deaths, and marriages, simply acknowledged by providing a dedicated blank space what had been a long-standing tradition of writing important family information in Bibles. Harper's Illuminated New Pictorial Bible was originally printed over a period of years, beginning in 1843, in an edition of 54 parts, and sold to subscribers for 25 cents each, or $13.50 for the complete Bible before binding. Harper's employed a new printing technology, electrotyping, to print the over 1,600 illustrations that were primarily integrated into the text, rather than bound in as a separate plates, although they also included some two-color pages to entice subscribers to continue subscribing. Electrotyping, which they use, is an electrochemical process for reproducing stereotyped woodblock and intaglio plates to create a printing surface that would hold up to the new high-speed printing presses. The individual parts of the Illuminated Bible, once the edition was completed in 1846, could then be bound up into a single volume. The bindings on the Harper's Bibles made heavy use of gilt stamping, which served not only as a visual cue to the preciousness of the contents, but also an indication of the piety and also the status of those who whose drawing rooms were graced with one of these large and impressive works. These illustrated Bibles came to play an important role in home life as it took on an increasingly religious character in the mid-19th century. Religious education was understood as having its beginnings and its ongoing reinforcements in reading the Bible and related works around the hearth, connecting home and family life to the church. Other publishers, including subscription publishers, seeing how quickly Harper's sold out of the initial press run of 50,000 copies of each part, that's 2.7 million parts at 25 cents per part, began viewing these large format Bibles as a lucrative market well worth pursuing. Elaborate gold stamp bindings became an essential part of the package, which these publishers began advertising as family Bibles. Subscription publishers were especially well placed to market these Bibles, and their canvassers or book agents brought with them canvassing books for their Bibles, containing sample text and images, variant bindings, broadside advertisements with prices and additional information about the publication, as well as blanked ruled pages on which subscriber names, addresses, and binding choices could be written down. These subscription publishers created family Bibles with a range of components at a variety of price points as they competed in the marketplace. One especially large and exceptionally comprehensive canvassing book in the Penn collection is for family Bibles published by the Globe Bible Publishing Company, and it's on display in the Lee Library if you haven't seen it already. Among the many options available to subscribers are more and larger illustrations, some in full color, a wide variety of texts situating the Bible in its geographical, natural, cultural, and historic setting, simple and fancy title pages, increasingly ornate presentation plates, marriage certificates, pages for recording births and deaths in the family, ornately decorated examples of prayers and parables, and even printed forms on which to add one's signature to an oath to abstain from all distilled, fermented, and malt liquors. Albums of pages for photographs of family members, and a range of binding choices from basic leather bindings to highly decorated boards containing Bible scenes and text stamped in gold, as you see here. This particular canvassing book dates from 1886 and describes and displays a wide range of options for 6 styles of family Bibles sold by the Globe Bible Publishing Company. Style number 6, I think I got the wrong one. Well, I'm missing that one. Style number 6, the most elaborate and expensive, contains 16 full-page steel engravings, some of which are imported from Europe expressly for this Bible, and 48 full-page wood engravings by Doré and other celebrated artists. It is described as a Bible warranted to give perfect satisfaction, which cannot be surpassed for money anywhere in the world. This particular example is especially valuable because it still contains all the slips in yellow and pink on which the publisher supplied to the canvasser or book agent printed text to be used in making their sales pitch. The book agents, many of whom were women, were meant to memorize these short speeches and then remove the slips from the canvassing book before showing them to potential purchasers. One especially interesting slip in this canvassing book extols the virtue of the family Bible by focusing specifically on family and not on Bible. The family Bible occupies a sacred place in the hearts of the people. Many persons who have little regard for the holy book are yet moved to the depths of their better feelings by the mention of the family Bible, awakening as it does within them the most sacred recollections of their earliest association of father, mother, home, brother, sister, and the erring wanderer returning feels that from its pages will be learned the forgiveness based on love, which it has been its great mission to teach. Many a man spends hours bending over the family Bible, constrained either by the sad or joyful associations connected with it. Here he finds the record of his marriage, and the simple lines recall the angel wife who has blessed his home with her love and dies. Or the sweet child whose little life comes back out of the born and died and seems to smile on him and kiss him. There he finds the text marked out, which was the last on the lips of his mother. There he finds the family portraits. Indeed, it is giving men the word of life recommended by the dearest and mightiest earthly influences to place the family Bible in their homes. There cannot be a nobler service to Christ and humanity than lies within the reach of the Bible agent. Such a Bible is a great educator, and its influence is powerful, even though it only lie on the center table, in sight, and rarely opened. Of course, for those actually interested in reading the Bible, the book agent could sell the New Parallel Bible, touted as 2 Bibles in 1 volume. This slip speaks to the merits of the New Parallel Bible, which prints the old King James Version of 1611 and the new 1885 Revised Version next to each other on the page. I'm out of sequence. Oh, that's the one I was looking for earlier. I was out of sequence. Sorry about that. There we are. Here's the sales slip. There we go. Sorry. Given the 1886 date of this canvassing book, the publishers clearly moved quickly to print and promote. I think this is it. There we are. Print and promote the new version of these parallel editions, found only in their more expensive Bibles. They reminded their agents to tell potential customers of the virtue of their parallel version, claiming that to see both versions in any other publisher's Bible, you will have to turn to different parts of their Bible. There is much more I can say about this topic in this particular example, but I'll conclude with 2 interesting discoveries relating to these family Bibles. The first being one I shared with Peter, and the second one that Jennifer Rosner at the Library Company shared with Peter, and then Peter shared with me. In the Globe Bible Publishing example, as you move up the ladder in terms of price, the illustrations go from inexpensive uncolored woodcuts to what are referred to as color wood engravings and illuminated lined steel engravings, printed in rich colors. What is especially interesting is that upon close comparison of the 3 versions, it is clear that each of these illustrations is printed from a different plate, and we assumed that they were all being printed from the same plate and just colored. So rather than differently colored versions of the same plate, this meant that it would have been added expense for the publisher. It's humorous, though, after seeing the uncolored woodcuts being sold by Globe in their cheapest Bibles, to read the agent's speech for the more expensive Style 6, which indicates that these fine line engravings in beautiful rich colors should not be confounded with the wretchedly printed parable plates that other publishers are putting in their Bibles. The second discovery is in the construction of the bindings, which, as represented by these covers and spines, gave the impression of being high-end work. However, as we can be seen in this image of one of these binderies, it was an early production line. The gilt stamp leather exteriors of these covers effectively hid their construction. As can be seen here, the interior reveals messily glued pieces of cardboard, referred to as junkboard in the 1864 patent titled Improvements in Embossed Covers for Books, which details the productions of these covers. In addition, the text block was attached to these heavy bindings by simply pasting in cords between the backboard and a piece of paper, which explains why so many of the surviving Bibles are in such poor condition, many with their covers detached. We have some of these deteriorating Bibles here at Penn, and I know that other institutions get regular queries about copies of family Bibles, mostly in fair to poor condition, from families seeking a good home for something they neither want nor want to throw away. These family Bibles, which came to occupy a sacred place in the homes and hearts of 19th century Americans, reveal much about publishers' success in refining the art of marketing in the second half of the 19th century. Thank you.
If the only prayer you ever said was thank you, said Meister Eckhart, that would be enough. If the only prayer you ever said was thank you, that would be enough. We could think of this whole conference as a kind of giant altar call for those to come up and testify to what Peter Stalybras has done for them. Put your hands on the family Bible. And yet, when we thank Peter, when we acknowledge our manifold indebtedness to him, we're not really only thanking Peter. We're thanking a whole community and a whole culture that exists on the 6th floor of the Van Pelt Library. It seems to me supremely important to remember that old adage of book history: the community makes the book, and the book in turn helps make the community. When we thank Peter Stalybras, we also thank Roger Chartier. We thank John and Lynn and Will and David and Jerry and Mitch and Zach and Dan, because these are the change agents. Individually and severally, these are the men and women who have had a profound effect on book history over time, one life at a time, one academic career at a time, one book, one piece of ephemera at a time. And so when we come together on this day, this gladsome day, it seems to me that we pay homage to a community and to a culture. And we would do well to bear in mind that the word culture is etymologically related to the word cultivate, to dig, to labor, to nurture, to help something to grow that in the end is beautiful and nourishing. This is the culture of the 6th floor of the Van Pelt Library at the University of Pennsylvania. Peter has been a major agent in that culture, but he would be the first to say, by no means the sole agent. The conditions of possibility were, as it were, ripe for him to flourish here. In paying homage to Peter Stalybras, we pay homage to this community, to this culture, to this library, and to this university. For my part, every time that I come here, and I have the enormous privilege to work with these people in this setting, I believe a little bit more in the old adage that the careful and judicious study of the humanities just might help make us become more humane. Thank you.
Alan, I'm curious about sales. Just taking the Shakespeare folios, the first folio sold out in 9 years. That seems good to me. But the second folio took over 30 years, and the third folio took over another 25. I mean, was this good business?
Yes. The way I get into this is the opposite of the way that the talk was structured. I began with that exact question of, were big books good investments? What was the market for big books like? And what I found was that, in general, big books over 100 edition sheets, had a higher reprint rate, twice as high as shorter books. And part of that reason was that not only was there not many of them, but they often included, like the Shakespeare First Folio, previously printed material. And so though it was a new collection, though it was a much bigger collection, they seem to have been built in a way that was designed to capitalize on previous success, previous interest by readers. And we actually end up seeing that in the in the reprint rates, which are up around 40% of just first editions. And most of these books are reprints of previous editions, which had even higher reprints. And so there weren't many of them. Most of the book trade was focused on smaller books, but these did sell really well. And so the Shakespeare First Folio is more illustrative than the second folio is in that regard.
But still, I mean, this publisher he's obtained the rights to the first folio quite expensively, presumably, and he prints the second folio, which is almost a page-for-page reprint, right? So I mean, he really is. He's banking on that market, right? And 30 years later, finally, there's a call for a next edition. It doesn't sound to me as if that's a fast reprint rate.
No, that's not a fast reprint. But in that regard, I would say two things. That the second folio, what they didn't know in 1632 is that there was going to be a civil war in the 1640s. And we've seen this with, Zach and I have written about this with play quartos in general. But the other thing that I think was happening in the 1640s and 1650s is that the book trade was disrupted in radical ways, which I think inhibited the reprinting of the second folio. And I would say, yeah, that doesn't mean that every single big book would sell out and be an economic success. But when you look at the aggregate, big books tended to be reprinted at twice the rate that shorter books did. And part of the reason for that was that they were, they were sort of conservative publications that weren't quite as risky as they seem. And so, yeah, that happened with the second folio. That totally could happen. I think part of the reason for that was the outbreak of the English Civil War. But yeah, well, I'm not saying every single big book did this, but on average, they were more likely to be reprinted than most of the short books were.
Thanks so much. I'm wondering, just to follow up, whether the margin for profit is greater with a big book because you're targeting wealthy people, and obviously you don't have to sell out in order to break even because most printed books have never been read. That's a Hugh Amory line.
Right.
Can you prove that bigger books made more profit per copy sold?
Oh yeah, they definitely, yes, they would have had more profit per copy sold, both at the level of the printer simply producing more sheets would have generated sort of more, shillings and pence, and likewise for booksellers as well. And so, yeah, they weren't so prevalent that the booksellers would have sort of been able to rely on them for a steady stream of income. But I think you're exactly right that given those margins, if things went bad, it was really bad. But you didn't. But once you got that break-even point, you're just going to be able to earn that much more in profits back.
This is a wonderful, diverse set of papers. I love them all in different ways. I have a question for Diane. I take your final point that the configuration of the letters and where the writing occurs on them and the grocery lists in addition to the poems is important. I wondered if some of the affect is hiding in a different form of textuality that's in that original letter, which is, I sent you a book, and by the time I see you, I hope to be your scholar. And so to think about whether that form of kind of metaphorical, pedagogical intimacy is a possible place that intimacy is hiding in the letter. It's also about textuality, but it's not necessarily about the configuration of the textuality.
Yeah, that's a great point. I kind of didn't have time to touch on every sentence in that short letter, but and I was hoping someone would ask me about that. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there's been a lot of great work done on the exchange of gifts, and on the exchange of books as gifts in particular, and that idea of a creation of intimacy, as you say, that's outside this particular text. But is nonetheless textual. I wish that she had said what the book was. That would have been amazing. Another thing you're making me think of, though, too, is I think we can look outside the text of what Anne Newdigate and what Frances Edgerton write on that letter in another way by looking at a part of the letter that I actually didn't mention, which is Anne's daughter Mary endorsing the letter and saying, this is a letter from the Countess of Bridgewater to my mother. And that's another kind of intimacy I think is really interesting in this letter, where there's this sense that it's not just for Anne. She can kind of anticipate that other people, perhaps other women, are going to be interacting with this. And we have this written record here of Mary, Anne's daughter, looking at this later, recalling this particular moment, stating what's going on here. And so there's this kind of homosocial community actually kind of widens in really interesting ways that point just beyond that text of the letter. And that's kind of what you're making me think of when you're saying there's also a book here.
But what about the business of calling her my servant?
Can someone help me with that?
Is it a class thing?
I don't think so. I think they're similar. They're a very similar status. I was hoping that someone here would have discovered that this is a term of endearment that women of a certain class use among each other or something. But I think I'm just going to have to keep looking.
What I wondered, it made me think of David Bergeron's edition of King James's letters, where James seems always to be trying on different relational metaphors for his relation to Buckingham. So scholar and servant and sweet friend and I just wondered if Frank as a kind of nickname for oneself. I just wondered if there was a kind of multiplicity of attempts to come to some way of figuring intimacy.
Yeah, and I'd be interested to see more of Frances Edgerton's letters too, to see if this is something she does with other women. Because you'd expect her to call herself the servant, I think, would be more sort of typical. But I think you're right. I think there's something more going on, and I would hesitate to call it role playing, but there's something really interesting happening in the way these women are imagining their relationship.
My question was related to that, which is the chains that you were talking about. And, I think in one of many, but certainly one of John Donne's verse letters to women, I think the one to Countess of Bedford at the death of Celia Bulstrode, he talks about, even though she's dead, there's no link lost in the chain. I think about Lanier also talks about that at the end of Cookham, right? Tying my soul with these rich chains. And I'm wondering if you have a hunch that is a kind of Janie Linky connective-y poetics that's particular to women's verse exchange.
I would say that I haven't seen enough instances of this to comment on it, but I would also say that I think we should be careful to kind of get overly symbolic about really useful things like bracelets that have links. That's it's so beautifully literal. When we think about all the other kinds of things that got sent with letters, and some of them are, I was talking about sweet. I mean, some of them like really sugared jams and stuff are really obviously, okay, I'm sweet on you, that sort of. But people sent shoulders of mutton, and that's another way of saying I value you and our friendship, but it's I don't want to read too much into the symbolism of that. So I'm sorry if that seems like a glib answer. I will think about that more because I think it's important, but I also think, it's not just beautiful homemade preserves and carefully chosen jewelry that has a symbolism. I think it's important to also think about the way that letters are often only part of what an epistolary exchange is in this period. Thank you for that.
So we have Caroline and then Meredith.
Yes, and I have a question for Alan, too, about big books and small books. And what about print runs? Because we know little about print runs, right? And can we assume that the print run for the first folio would be the same as for a small book, and vice versa? And I'm thinking also of single shade prints. Because it seems that thousands and thousands of those were printed. So, I'm not talking about profit here necessarily, but simply about the number of printed sheets.
Right. In general, it would, on the one hand, it would make sense, given the cost involved and the risk involved, for big books to have smaller print runs. On the other hand, I also think that it would have been first editions that would, on average, have had smaller print runs. And because those were the riskiest. They have a reprint rate in the aggregate of around 20%. By the time you get up into second and third editions, you're talking about reprint rates of 50, 60, 70%. And so I feel like the difference between first editions and reprint editions would have been a place where more variability in print runs. Also, the over 8 decades, we're looking, 24,000 extant editions. I think on average, a lot of these things would have sort of gravitated to a certain mean. And then the last thing I would say about sort of the print runs of reprints is that the 7th edition of Fox's Acts and Monuments in 1632, which the Stationers' Company wanted to reprint, and 3 printers immediately leapt up and said, we'll publish this and we'll print it. And then a couple of years later, they're like, well, we'll finish the printing, but we need to get some other people to fund it. And then 16 booksellers decided that they would sort of be the publishers of it if Robert Young would ever finish his section of the edition, because he was doing other things. Well, he was sort of acting a little bit unethically in their mind. But the interesting thing is, so this is a huge book. It's 801 edition sheets. The 3 printers sort of got 2 years into it and needed to get booksellers to sort of see it through. And you would assume, like, well, the print run for this must have been not that high, but in fact, it was 1,600 copies. And so it's a massive book, and they didn't go for like a 500 copy run. They went with a 1,600 copy run. And I think that probably tells us something important about the press runs of reprint editions, where there was already the expectation that this book would sell. And ballads, yeah, no matter the thing I would say is, like, no matter how many copies were sold of individual ballads, I don't think it would radically change the sort of pattern of printed sheets, that distribution, very much. I mean, if I were to increase that number, from 24,000 to 30,000 to 40,000, it would have only small effects. And I think that is where print runs come in. Like, even if you say ballads had print runs that were, they were always 1,500 copies, that would only, affect the margins of that distribution as opposed to really changing things.
I have a question response to Alan Niles' really marvelous paper. It's really more like enthusiasm and asking for a little bit more response. I just love the way in which you read the 1676 elegies as not indexical, as that they're about the Winthrops, but they don't index the time of that they talk about it. Because vernacular poetry is almost always, by Americanists at least, valued insofar as it points beyond itself to the historical event. So I wonder if you could say some more about how you read, how your wonderfully detailed recovery of the fake, or the fakeness, isn't it? It's just like dislocated, temporal dislocation, how that dislocation affects how we're now invited to read the poems.
Thanks so much. I mean, I think I'm still puzzling over this question and what modes of reading to adopt in relation to these texts. I do think that the tendency too much with Puritan poetry has been to abstract and generalize, we need both to root them more specifically in chronological moments, and at the same time to break them out of those chronological moments and think about reprinting and survival and the families and sort of historical interests that result in these texts being carried forward and read, and in some cases also reprinted. I think there's actually quite a bit more historical reprinting, or actually first printing of both elegies and other kinds of texts as broadsides as happening in the 18th and even also in the 19th century. Some of these, actually have imprints that tell us they were printed later, right, and that they are some kind of 17th century text that is being printed in the 19th century, but many of them don't. And how to deal with these is I think still a bit of a mystery.
Question for Lynn. I really enjoyed your description of what the saleswomen were bringing to their potential customers. And it seems in some way what they were doing is selling a mix and match Bible. And as you were describing that, I thought back to Jim Kearney's paper and the difficulties of making a decision. That in fact, decision may be the trigger to some kind of insanity or madness. And I know if I was faced with all those choices, trying to buy a Bible, I probably wouldn't know what to put together. So, I mean, is it really the case that each one of these Bibles that was purchased ended up being an individual kind of unique item, or in fact, did they just fall into certain categories and, a customer would buy what her neighbor had bought and it would be virtually identical?
Great question, because we were missing that page that came up later. I inverted my slides, unfortunately. You were given certain groups of options. So you basically would move from the less expensive to the most expensive. And there would be a fair difference in the price between them. They would come with certain kinds of options. But it wasn't like you could just pick and choose which one. So they grouped things together, and they became higher prices. So you would have more options. You'd have more images in color. You would have the additional features, your pages for births, deaths, marriages, whatever. Temperance pledges would be fancier. All of those kinds of things would be building on, so you were, and, part of it was that by having these subscription pages, you could actually see what other people in your neighborhood were buying. So, okay, they're all buying the expensive one. I'm going to buy the expensive one too. I don't want to be outdone by my neighbor or something of that sense as well,
That's very helpful. Are there any instances of a buyer changing her mind?
I haven't come across it, because usually, I think people may, when they came back, so you would put in subscribe to what you wanted, and they would come back a period later and actually bring the book. Now, there were people who wouldn't be home by the time they, or would make sure no one actually answered the door or something like that. So there were always items that had been subscribed for, which never ultimately sold. And then what happens sometimes is that, these book agents are stuck with some extra volumes, and they would actually give it to somebody to sell, and you would find some of these quote-unquote subscription books showing up in shops because they were desperate to get rid of them. They hadn't found anyone, so they figured they'd put them in a shop.
Okay, Peter gets the last word for this session.
Wonderful panel. They've all been fantastic panels. This is a question for Alan and Lynn, and relates to Alan Niles and Lynn, but also relates to Alan's. I thought it's a fabulous panel. The question that occurs to me is, in a way, when you're looking at the specificities, historical and geographical specificities, what you actually have in your case, Alan, is, much less printing going on than we imagine. So first of all, one has to put back, and that comes back also to Diana's work, you really have to put in New England manuscript right at the center of the picture, because not that much printing is going on. And then imported books, of course. So books are getting imported, but there's not much printing going on. And then I thought, what was fabulous is then switching to Lynn, the scale. You're looking at something just totally different. And you look at the machinery, you look at this new thing, which goes to the other Alan's point, which is this is a really successful way to publish big books. And so you've got very big books being sold on a huge scale. door to door. So it's actually door-to-door salesman, which is also how encyclopedias were being sold in the 20th century, right? So this became a common practice in England, but it's not a common practice. It's not being done in England at that point. So I just thought the scale was sort of fascinating that you're looking at, these two very, very different scales. But I did think, just relating to your point, Alan Farmer, the little jobs question. I actually totally agree with you, by the way. I
agree with you too.
That's you never want to contradict Alan Farmer on statistics, right? Because what he didn't tell you is he came from Wharton. That's where you started. But I'm thinking about, the work that I was doing, Little Jobs, came out of the work that Jim Green and I were doing at that point, which is mainly about America, although I did generalize, of course, as I always do. So the work in America, what Jim had shown is that, by and large, people like Franklin weren't book printers at all. So he just didn't print books, by and large, one, possibly two a year. All the rest is job printing. So he's just a job printer. And of course, the scale in London is a whole different situation, even in the 16th century. The only thing I would add to that is I do think we may still massively underestimate job printing. And just to give one final example of why I think that, I think there are genres even. You did a wonderful job of showing all these genres. But there's a single example in Beinecke of a 1520s advertisement to be cut up, sliced up, to stick onto bottles. Now, to my knowledge, I've never seen another example of anything like that from the whole of the 16th century. But there's no reason at all to believe if you think of a shop today, of course it won't be a shop like today, but literally if you want to see what printing is today, you go into any shop and you see Kellogg's cornflakes packet, and it's upmarket printing. That's the top end of printing, is ephemera. And that's the other thing I just want to emphasize is top-end printing is often ephemera. So it's ephemera, genuine ephemera, but more skill goes into it. And there's a point that Jim really made to me very early on, that today, wedding invitations, business cards, per square inch, so you're absolutely right. Of course, they're tiny. So they are genuinely ephemera. They genuinely don't take up many sheets of paper, but per square inch, you can make a good business out of business cards. You can make a good business out of, lots of wedding invitations. This is actually, and it's very high-end business too.
Right. One of my favorite
funerals too.
Yeah, one of my favorite points in your article is your point about William Jaggard, how he was the printer to the City of London, and we only have a couple of those documents, but clearly he must have been printing a lot more of those, and that our narrative at the Jaggards doesn't prioritize that part of their business, but that too would have been a sort of lucrative, high-end kind of ephemeral printing. And so it's sort of two different, sort of like the poles of the printing houses that I feel like we're talking about.
I was just going to say, I think one of the interesting things about the Bibles that were being canvassed is that so many of the components were just these components that they put in, and they were the same components for all of them. So your basic printed pages for the Bible, no matter whether you bought the cheap $5 edition or the expensive $15 edition, were the same pages, or these additional materials they put in. So basically, those are huge runs that they do. And for the German Bibles, they're actually importing the Luther text and just adding these other elements that they've translated into German to it. So, there's a way in which they're playing around with how they can, print huge numbers, but they're all basically the same, except for small things that they're able to change out and charge more money for.
Okay, let's take another brief 5-minute break, and we will come back, and some of us will hopelessly try to sum up what we've... Okay, we will now engage in a fruitless effort to sum up the riches of today on this closing roundtable, which I'm sure will be filled with deep insight and funny stories about Peter. Roger, we'll start.
Yeah. We have spent this day visiting Peter's world. Perhaps we could now consider another perspective, Peter in the world, Peter abroad. I do not want to accompany him and Hanny in his love for Provence and the Châteauneuf-du-Pape particularly, Tuscany or Venice. I shall not be able to follow him in the frozen ridges of the Alps, as said Mowbray, and nor to climb with him the rocks and mountains. We have seen a beautiful illustration of this Peter. And I shall also ignore Peter in England, where he is not abroad, but at home. My topic is the globalization of Peter's work. Let us begin with Brazil, where Peter's book, O Casaco de Marx, Marx quote, which doesn't exist as such in English, is a steady seller. The first edition was issued in 1999, and I have the first quarto here. And the fourth edition was recently published, and this fourth edition has different and elegant cover pages for the book. All the reviews published in Cult, in Yara, Revista de Moda e Cultura e Arti, or in Livro Café, praises a book moving, profound, poetic. For Marcia Tiburi in Cult, the book improves Marx's theory of the fetish and leads the reader to tears when it describes the pitiful condition of Marx in London. For Juliana Luisa de Melo Schmidt in Yara, the book is emocionante, moving, because twice his author, with great sensibilidad, links the topic of the work, the relations between closures, memory, and suffering, with personal experiences. The death of a dear friend, whose closures tell more than any remembrance his present absence, or the entrance in the old age of a father who is no more able to climb until the top of a Scottish mountain with his two sons. Brazilian reviewers, and I suppose readers, were touched by a book that shared with them such deep feelings and sorrows. But as proven by YouTube, some young Brazilian ladies who have made video review of the book in programs devoted to fashion had a lighter approach. As you can see, the second one proposed a choreography inspired by the book O Casaco de Marx. Another one, perhaps the first one, invites a viewer to read the book I have just received a book which is published by Authentica. And what is this book? Oh, yeah. I shall open the box with you. Huh? Okay. We can go. Yeah, she invites the reader to read the book and to think about their own clothes or their recollection attached to them. This video program is a program on fashion. And the third one, which is interesting, she has a certain difficulty to pronounce the name of the author. Voilà. Yeah. And in the mail, we accompanied this program about fashion. She's thanked by one of her followers who wrote on the electronic communication, I must write a paper about this book tomorrow, and you helped me a lot. Now let us cross the Atlantic for meeting another Peter, the strolling player. He and David Ruderman staged a textual dialogue entitled Reading the Bible, Jewish and Christian Interpretation of the First Verses of Genesis. Their show was presented at the Universitair Centrum Sint Ignatius in Antwerp in 2013 and at the Goethe Universität in Frankfurt in 2016. These performances could have been the first episodes of a very long series. There are indeed 5,853 verses in the Pentateuch. After an intermission, the touring biblical dialogue will perhaps be resumed with another verse. And recently, David Ruderman suggests that for the world in which we live, on both sides of the Atlantic, a good choice could be Leviticus 19, verse 17, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Peter's peregrination spread the materiality of the text all over the world. For example, at the Ben Gurion University at Be'er Sheva in 2008, during a conference, Literature, Book History, and the Anxiety of Disciplinarity, or at the Central European University at Budapest in 2016, at a moment when the threats of the Hungarian government against this academic institution were beginning. I do not forget that Peter's words reached also my own country. In 1995, the translation of the essay he wrote with Margherita de Grazia, La matérialité du texte shakespearien in French, was published in the journal Genesis, Revue Internationale de Critique Génétique. It obliged French genetic critics to rethink their classical approach that always supposed a textual trajectory from authorial manuscript to printed books. For Shakespeare, there is no manuscript and no book before 1623. Peter and Margherita's essay was translated by Delphine Lemonnier and François Larocque. 15 years later, François Larocque, a French Shakespearean, attended the lecture given by Peter at the Collège de France in 2010. Two of these lectures were given in French, Montaigne, Shakespeare et le suicide, and Shakespeare n'a jamais écrit un livre. Shakespeare never wrote a book. Unfortunately, these lectures were not recorded, and we cannot listen to Peter en français dans le texte. But I remember vividly the impact they had on the French Shakespearean scholar and on the editors of Shakespeare in translation in French. Time has passed, and I shall end there my short comment about Peter's travels. It would have been possible to go with him to Spain, where his essay on Marx Code was translated as El Saco de Marx, to Portugal, where his article on naming, renaming, and unnaming in Shakespeare is a required reading in the Master of Critica Textual at the University of Lisbon, or to Italy, where I remember that two Italian Shakespearean scholars, Donatella Palotti and Paola Pugliatti, were very glad to meet Peter in Florence in 2015. All around the world, Peter has left the same traces. We know what their names are: generosity, enthusiasm, care, kindness. David Ruderman is right. Peter is the right person to comment upon Leviticus 19:17. Everywhere, people remember his presence with saudade, this Brazilian, undefinable sentiment that inscribed in the sadness of the absence, the proximity of the mind and the arts. Thank you.
So I get the unfortunate task of following that. Well, if Roger traced Peter's career through the globe and through the great universities of the world, I've spent probably most of my time with Peter in bars. Has its own set of pleasures, I will admit. And in spite of the wonderful entomological information we got before, Peter is clearly a bee, not a spider, but as Will Fisher slyly suggested, he's a queen bee. And I think for everybody's here, you'll share my sense that the joy that's just been so evident at this conference is the fitting tribute, but also consequence of Peter's irrepressible, inexhaustible, energy and excitement and generosity and generativity. He's made all of us smarter, and he's made all of us happier. And one trope for that today has been the phrase a number of the speakers have used, "I wouldn't be here without Peter." And I want to ring a quick change on that, though. Peter would not be here without me. Or to be a little more exact, without me, Nancy Vickers, and of course Annie. And the story is that when Nancy and I were at Dartmouth, I guess the proper word, I was going to say we ran a search. We manipulated a search,
we did.
I think is the proper word.
Manipulated
We manipulated a search that was designed to end with Peter's hiring, which we succeeded in doing. And the only difficulty, everyone realized how wonderful he was and how bright. The only difficulty was Peter, as he's very proud to say, does not have a PhD. And some of our colleagues thought this was going to be a problem getting this through. And I do think, by the way, with all the eminence in this room, someone could get Penn to give him an honorary PhD and make an honest man of him. This fraudulent career that...
He has an honorary PhD.
Yeah, but Penn should give it to him. So we...
I gave it to him. Queen Mary gave it to him.
Oh, well, that's a good thing, too. But in his home university here. So we got him here. He came. He was wonderful. And instantly we discovered the Dartmouth motto, as I know at least one other person here knows, the Dartmouth motto is Vox Clamantis in Deserto, a voice crying in the wilderness. And Peter got here, and it was suddenly clear Dartmouth's vision of that is Dartmouth's the voice, crying in the wilderness, New Hampshire. Peter got there and quickly said Dartmouth was the desert, and Peter was the voice. And the wonderful image of Michael Suarez, he cultivated this desert with both conversation and alcohol, sort of the Eliezer Wheelock of the then 20th century. And it really was wonderful having him. And it was a wonderful moment in Dartmouth's history. There are all sorts of fabulous people who were there in the 80s and then fled as soon as they could. And there was this community, one of the great reading groups I ever was part of, where we would meet weekly, drink a lot, read somebody we hadn't known well enough. And the greatest moment I've ever had in those, a great line, which I know Nancy and Peter will remember, we were reading Echo, and we had this argument about what something meant. And it was the greatest bit of academic one-upsmanship I've ever seen. A woman philosopher said, "Well, I think you're wrong, and the last time I slept with Umberto..." Yeah, so we gave in at that moment. But all paradises are lost, and soon this one was too. At the end of that year, Nancy left to go to USC, I left to go to Columbia, but the three of us had planned an MLA panel for the following winter. And we all meet at MLA, and we hug, and we miss each other and tell stories. And Peter gets up, and he begins, as Peter does, graciously acknowledging that Nancy and I had been largely responsible for getting him to the States. And then he paused, and he takes off his glasses, and he rubbed his eye, and he said, "But they left me there." And then the next sentence was, "This paper is an act of revenge." And then the wonderful Scully Brasian laugh. And then, of course, his revenge was to graciously acknowledge us for contributions we had never made and make our own work sound smarter and more consequential than it ever was. But that's what Peter does. And it does seem to me, for his students, and I've read a lot of recommendations he's written, he makes us all sound smarter than we are. And if we listen, sometimes we actually get a little bit smarter. He really is wonderful. He is our Queen Bee, and I feel lucky to have been in that colony.
I'm going to follow up on, this morning Christopher talked about Peter's late career turn to America. I'm going back to Peter's mid-career turn to America, which was the move to Dartmouth, and there is an additional little anecdote about that moment that I will never forget. Many of you, I am sure, have been part of recruitment dinners when you're hiring a new full professor into the Department of often English, but could be anything, indeed. But on only one recruitment dinner that I have ever attended, to go to Julie's comment about Peter's agelessness, has the waitress carded the candidate. Remember this, Peter? It really happened. It really and truly happened. And then I just want to add to that particular footnote, because these were indeed very funny times, and I've always felt very bad about abandoning Peter in Hanover, New Hampshire, after one short year. But I do want to also turn to something that everyone here has talked about. So this is not going to be news to anyone, but I think it has a certain pattern in which it tends to happen in my life, largely because I don't see Peter and Annie every day. I see Peter and Annie in, kind of specific moments where, they're visiting for 2 or 3 days, or I'm visiting them for 2 or 3 days. And so we're all catching up. And at which point, I will sort of announce what it is that I'm working on. Take, for example, that I'm doing a project on celebrity, and that I got asked to do it because, in fact, I've worked on people who are celebrities, but I know there's this whole universe of criticism about celebrity out there, and I don't even know where to begin. Okay, Peter has now gone to the sofa. He has opened up the computer, and in the time that I take to produce breakfast for Peter, Annie, and myself, I now have a bibliography on celebrity. I kid you not. I have a bibliography on celebrity. He persists in working on my bibliography on celebrity for much of the morning. And what has never come out in all of these, totally heartfelt, and I feel it more than anyone, because my work has been so inflected by Peter and Annie's presence in my life. But there is, to that sort of incredible generosity, a slight bossy pants quality. Annie, I'm sure, will have something to say about that. That there's a kind of edge in which he's sort of taking over the project. Then you move back into negotiation, and it works out just brilliantly. Then they take off and leave, and 4 days later, some random used bookseller sends you a copy of a book called The Celebrity by Winston Churchill, the other Winston Churchill. And then a week later, you get an email with additional bibliography. So I just, what is so extraordinary to all of us is how this work has infused our work, and what an extraordinary presence both Peter and Annie have been in our lives, in that sense of just the intellectual integrity and the intellectual excitement and enthusiasm that they bring to the table. And so those are my little contributions to the celebration of Peter and Annie for me.
We've heard a lot about Peter's collaborative work, so I think we should hear from his collaborator on one of his great works, Renaissance Clothing and the Materials of Memory.
I'm glad to be asked to do this now, because I'm not sure I want mine to be the last words. And I'm going to follow Simran's reminder of Peter's recipe for a good, talk. 1.2 examples. And the point is that it was hell to work with Peter, too. And the first example, and this was from the very beginning of our writing together, we were in my apartment in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was a terrible little kind of row apartment. Terribly hot. It was probably in August. Yes, yeah. May I say it, please? So we met because we were both interested in the French theorist Louis Althusser. I mean, that is really why we met, because we were at a kind of cocktail party at Smith to present the new arrivals to the old ones. I wasn't even going to go to this, but a friend said, you have to go. You'll like some people you'll meet in French. So I went, and here's this very interesting guy with lots of hair. And we were standing in a kind of figure eight. It was a pillar here, and I was standing here holding forth about Althusser to my comp lit friends. And Peter was standing here kind of looking aghast at the people who were going to be his colleagues in the English department. And he overheard me talking about Althusser, and he sort of peered around the column, and from then on we sort of phone chased each other and then finally ended up together very fast. So in the summer, after this wonderful year of romantic international connection, we decided we would write an article using Althusser to talk about Philip Sidney and his sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella. This was a terrible idea. I mean, if there was one thing we needed to do, it was spend the summer relaxing, because he was going back to England, you know, and who knew when we would meet again. So we organized the work this way. I would analyze the first two sonnets. Peter would analyze a third and write a kind of conclusion. And this was a terrible plan because, you know, I put out my two analyses. That put him in the position of, you know, how will we use this? How are we doing here? And he said, these are terrible. And he didn't really mean they were terrible. He meant he had a lot more to say about these things. But we were sitting in that 90-degree, humid apartment for about 3 weeks, screaming at each other. So that's point number one, and I think I've been fairly clear about what it demonstrates. And then when it came to the book about clothes, I think we actually collaborated pretty well. We'd learned what some of the pitfalls were, and we were both very interested in the subject, and it's wonderful to write about something new with someone who's also getting into it in a kind of first way. So we wrote the book. There were up and down moments. We got the proofs from Cambridge University Press. Don't ask me how this happened. When we were in Urbino, traveling to Urbino. We were in a hotel in Urbino. I have always wanted to go to Urbino. And suddenly, here we are, sitting in this lobby, proofing, you know, correcting these galleys. There was some terrible urgency about getting them back to England. So this would have been fine. We were cooperating, and we realized, you know, we can do this pretty fast. But then he decided he didn't like the way I do the delete sign, you know? I mean, I used this little Greek D, which is a perfectly respectable symbol for delete. But he said, they're not going to know what you mean here. So here we are in the beautiful city of Urbino, and I'm whiting out my delete sign. And finally, I just stood up and I said, you do it, and stamped off to see the Duke's palace. So it's been a long span of doing things together. But something that Lynn said absolutely pins it down for me, which is that Peter gets so interested in your project, and this is what Nancy was saying, that all these things unfold, and he's so excited, and he does. He sends you a bibliography overnight. It's been wonderful to write, how should I put this, to write my work in company with Peter, which is not the same thing as collaborating. And that, I think, has been absolutely wonderful, his generosity, and also the way he challenges you. You know, this could be a lot better. So I guess I would conclude by saying the only thing worse than writing with Peter would be not writing with Peter.
I just have to say one quick thing, because now we've heard a lot about Peter collaborating. And I had the pleasure, it was a pleasure of collaborating with Peter, and we decided that we wanted to co-teach a grad class together and write an article together to see if we could pull this off, like, at the same time. And I remember I was very excited for this. I've been learning from Peter. Literally, the book Staging the Renaissance that Peter and David co-edited is the whole reason I'm studying the Renaissance. I mean, I read that book in college and decided to do this. So I've been learning from Peter for a long time. I was very excited. I felt in very august company. He had collaborated with some of my favorite scholars up here, and I said, I'm excited, and your article with Margreta was very important to me. That must have been an incredible collaboration. And Peter looked at me and said, it really almost destroyed our friendship. So I was nervous going in. But somehow, alchemically, it came together, and it was not hugely difficult. I don't know why. It may have been that we met every week to prep class and go eat Italian food afterwards. But the class, teaching the class was difficult, much more than the writing. And there are some people who were in that class here, and I'm sure they quickly came to realize the way the class would work is Peter would go crazy and go on incredible flights of fancy, brilliant, but had nothing to do with the lesson plan for the day. And my job was like just to sort of slowly try, oh, okay, that's amazing stuff about Ben Franklin. We're actually studying. Today is Heracles. It was very useful for me because I'm like an over-planner of class prep. Peter's not an over-planner of class prep. But it was it actually was I've tried to teach, not like Peter, but a little bit further on the spectrum to Peter and away from me since that time. So I also want to say that people often point out that Peter can only work in collaboration. Like he's only published books in collaboration, but it's not strictly true, as Roger reminded us. It's just that entirely fittingly, the only book he's published alone cannot be read in English.
I take it as a sign of the great love we all feel for Peter that nobody has talked about his emailing today. And Peter has two modes of email, generally. Either you get one of these enthusiastic effusions, which is a huge PowerPoint that crashes your computer, right? It's too large. Or else you know that you're sending to Peter something that may be of importance or urgency, and you realize you're casting it into some kind of digital oubliette from which it will never emerge. And yet, we forgive him everything because, as we all know, Peter is wonderful. Thinking about today's talks and the very rich program, one comes away. I came away with the paradox of Peter, which is that there is no person more collaborative, more generous than Peter, and yet we all know that Peter will take something in an idiosyncratic way and make it a Stalibrasism or Staliism, and we recognize that he will turn it into his own hobby horse. And we've watched Peter ride many hobby horses over the years. We've heard a lot of them, so I was ticking them off. There was clothing, there was erasable paper, there's how the folds of a letter inflect the meanings of a letter, there are filing systems, common placing with Pastorius, job printing. We missed a few of the biggies. I don't think we got into bookmarks at all. We didn't get into wormholes. And then there are the more wax tablets, I think, did not appear today. And then there are the particular stories that we hear over and over again. There are the royalist traces in the New England Primer. We all know that, right? There are the pages of Fanny Hill bound into the binding boards of 19th century children's books. Pepys' diary was a very big thing for a while. Maybe it still is. And let us not forget Christ's foreskin. Somehow we did miss those.
Bingo.
But what I want to say is we've not talked much about the history of material text workshop, this thing that has gone on every Monday afternoon at Penn for we don't know how many years, but we will know one of these days. And the remarkable things are that whatever hobby horse Peter is riding that year, no matter what the talk is about, his first question will bring in the hobby horse. So it may be it may have been a presentation on Sumerian tablets, and he will talk about folding letters, and we know that you can't fold a Sumerian tablet. And yet, all of those questions are supremely intelligent and generative, and the hobby horses make us think about what we have just heard in totally different ways, and ways in which the speaker invariably has not thought. But the speaker should have. The speaker should have. No, well, maybe not the folding, the Sumerian tablets. But what's also, I think, remarkable to those of us who attend the workshop regularly is that the so-called outsiders will ask questions or lead the discussion in ways that are really topic-driven from within their disciplines, right? But those of us who have, sat at the foot of Peter for many years will ask totally different kinds of questions that, we never would have known to ask without Peter. The other thing I want to mention without going on too long, and Peter's collaborations, is also the collaboration that I have shared with Peter and Roger and Michael Suarez and Joe Farrell and Leah Price, Tony Grafton on the material text series. That is one of the generative things that Peter has done is seeded a book series from his interests. First book published in 2001. We have just published the 57th book in the series. There are numbers of people in this room who are authors in that series, and I will not ask the question that is on the bingo sheet about another author in waiting. But I will just want to say that working with Peter and learning from Peter over the years has really been one of the greatest blessings and gifts of my professional life. So.
Right, well, it's interesting having the last word, because I think I must be the person who's known Peter the longest here, because I've known him since 1971, and indeed, I can tell you that I and various other people were so thrilled when he met Annie, and I think that his life took a great turn for the better. But I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you about all the other things that made us have that view. But anyway, that was definitely the case. That was 1978, wasn't it? And a very good turn in his life that was. So I just wanted to say a couple of things, and I think that I'm actually here by virtue of having co-written an article with Peter, which was actually a relatively recent thing. And what happened was, I'd been to some of his talks when he'd been in England about print and manuscript and everything, so I sort of knew the background. And he said to me one day, we were at my house, and he said, I think, don't correct me if this is wrong, this is my memory of what he said. He said, I think I'm going to take my print and manuscript sort of way up into the 20th century, and have you, can you think of anything that would be interesting from the First World War about print and manuscript? And as it happened, I said, yes. And I had in my house an archive which included the Field Service postcard that my mother's uncle had sent just before he was killed in 1917. So produced this Field Service postcard, which, as I'm sure you all know, is a printed document to be written on in a very restricted way by hand. So we wrote the article as a result of that, in a way, and I thought it was very interesting because, I mean, talk about bossy pants. Here was something where First World War, I work on, he doesn't. Secondly, my family's archive. And it was all I could do to sort of control him so we had some equality in the writing of this article. So that was one thing which was very new and exciting experience, and I'm very pleased with the result. It's great. But the second thing that I wanted to say was that in this period before sort of, the happy moment of meeting Annie and deciding to come and work here, Peter was, of course, at Sussex, and that's where I knew him. And that was an extraordinary group of people who, I'd have to say, I was only a student. They were mostly on the staff. So I didn't really know them, but I know about them, and I sort of knew them, and later I got to know them. And it was a very productive time. And there's a very interesting piece that Jonathan Dollimore wrote last year about Alan Sinfield, who, as I'm sure you know, died last year. And Jonathan described, it sounded absolutely ghastly to me, but it's a Christmas in 1983. These two were there, Jonathan and Alan were there, Alan White was there, and Jonathan Dollimore said in this, very confident way, 2 books emerged from that week, holed up in a cottage in Shropshire, and they were his and Alan Sinfield's Political Shakespeare, and the transgression book that Peter and Alan White had, according to Jonathan Dollimore, sort of gestated on that trip. And what I was just going to say about this, which is in a way, though maybe we can have this in the drinks afterwards rather than in front of everybody, what I'd be really interested to know is I was looking at that book again recently, and it is very Althuserian. It's absolutely... it's full of ideology, and there's a bit of, Derrida and Freud and all kinds of fancy theory in that book. It's actually quite a theoretical vocabulary with its constitutive ambivalence and, sort of hegemony and ideology and so forth. And yet all that world which generated such interesting and very forming ideas for a lot of us was also, in some ways, I've been very aware of this today when this is such a generous spirit of this occasion today. And that world of that theory in Sussex was quite harsh in some ways, and maybe one might say a bit sectarian and a bit cruel and so on. But on the other hand, it's a very sharp break that's been made with it to go to where we are today. And in some ways, I'm quite sympathetic to that break. But I would be interested to know, in a way, whether one just leaves all that theory behind, or whether parts of it sort of carry on into the way in which you think about the work that you're doing now. So that was a question that has come up, as I've been through the day. So, thank you.
You don't have an answer? Okay, I want to thank everyone on the closing roundtable and everyone who spoke today. It was, I thought, really an amazing batch of papers, both in the substance of them, the work that had gone into them, and some genuinely moving comments, I thought, from the speakers about their relationship to Peter. We have one more occasion, and we're going to make Peter come up.
You can talk from wherever you like. You can talk from here, or you can sit down.
Where's the...
No, I'm not talking.
You're not talking.
No, I'm not talking. First. They need to drink. First.
Oh, thank you so much. This means a lot to me, partly because this is printed by David Comberg at the Common Press. And David and I talked together, and it was part of a very different part. One thing I would say hasn't really come up today, which is a turn to thinking about actually working with your hands, and I'm useless at it. So for me, it's really, Robbie Glenn says I'm one of those people who is dyslexic, but physically dyslexic. It's like, if I fold things, I fold them the wrong way, and everything goes wrong. So David and I actually taught this course, which was, we taught people how to bind. We actually did binding. We made paper. One of the students actually made a series of kinds of paper out of every kind of vegetable you can imagine. My favorite was carrot paper, which actually is self-destructive. And so she photographed it as it ate away at itself. And so you got getting black and things. It was fantastic. It was just an art object itself. So David itself, and the work that has gone into this conference, I just have to say, has been absolutely unfair. So what Michael Suarez said is 100% true. That this is a place that inspires. It's been, I can't imagine my career without the sixth floor, which of course will continue. And that's the other thing to say, you know, I mean, as long as the English department will have me back, I will come back, I will teach with Roger, because we've sort of have done this for years. Both of us like repetition. Every kind of repetition. We like to eat the same food, we like to, you know, we basically like to go to the same restaurant. Roger will go to a hotel and want to stay in exactly the same room. Every room is identical. In room 212, so that's where he wants to stay. And just the only other final thing I'd say, which hasn't come up today, because it's really a new adventure, but I'm so delighted to have Matthew Collins here, who's, stand up Matthew. So this represents, you know, for me a whole new departure. He is the Niels Bohr Professor of Archaeobiology. It's something else now, but it used to be called archaeobiology. So this is part of a project that he initiated called Beasts and Books, which really is an animal history that came out of a total change of thinking about what it meant to be an archaeologist. So someone actually studied, so it's an example of that gives me inspiration, is when you see someone who comes to a point in their discipline and is working on bones, because that's what you're trained to do, and suddenly realizes, what a waste of time working on bones. When you can walk into any library and find millions of animals, and that is parchment. And this library is full, so it's going to change the way we think about this library. It has changed the way we think about this library. That we're dealing with animals, we're going to have to deal with a whole different way of thinking about every aspect, you know. So this is part of the future. So there's a past, there's a future, but what a wonderful day. What a wonderful day.